Standardised estimates of revenue raised in Scotland and spending for Scotland under the current constitutional arrangements. GEAR shows that Scotland's tax revenue is rising and its notional deficit is falling, on the back of continued economic growth, rising exports and falling unemployment. However, that success and wider potential is directly threatened by the UK Government's drive to take Scotland out of the world's largest single market. That poses a huge risk to Scottish jobs, investment and living standards, which is why we will do all we can to secure the least damaging Brexit possible.
Richard Lyle.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer and state that I, for one, welcome the fact that Scotland's public finances are improving, and encourage everyone in this chamber to celebrate the news that overall revenue in Scotland reached £60 billion for the first time ever. Surely the Cabinet Secretary therefore agrees that such figures underline the fact that Scotland has a productive and growing economy despite the UK Government's London-centric economic policies.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's fair to say that further to the figures, over the course of the summer there's been a number of economic indicators that show a very welcome trend in Scotland: falling unemployment, increased productivity, continuation that Scotland is an attractive place to invest for foreign direct investment, second only to London, and other indicators that show an increasing confidence. All the more reason to build on that success, and that's why I welcome so much of the economic interventions announced by the First Minister yesterday.
Richard Lyle. That's okay, quite enough from Richard Lyle. Murdo Fraser. Sorry, Richard. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Richard Lyle strangely omitted to mention in his question that what the GERS figures tell us is that the union dividend in Scotland now amounts to £1,882 for every man, woman and child, which leads to record higher public spending per capita in Scotland of £1,576. That's spending more than the UK average on schools and hospitals and all the things that matter to us. Wouldn't the Cabinet Secretary agree it would be reckless folly to put these fiscal transfers from the rest of the UK at risk by pursuing a policy of Scottish separation?
Cabinet Secretary.
On the contrary, of course, as Murdo Fraser would expect me to say, that small advanced economies around the world are doing better than Scotland. What's the one thing that they've got that we've not? And that's independence. If we had the full levers of independence, we'd be able to stimulate our economy even further and have a more prosperous and fairer society. Murdo Fraser references the notional deficit. Now, that notional deficit is a product of the current constitutional position, not Scottish independence.
James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the £13.4 billion deficit in the reported GERS figures, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary and author of the SNP Cuts Commission report what areas of public spending he would propose to cut and his plan to try and sever the links of Scotland from the rest of the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think what the Growth Commission makes clear, and James Kelly's had a number of months now to have read the Growth Commission. It appears that he still hasn't read it. The Growth Commission sets out a way that we can grow the economy, grow our public services and reduce the notional deficit at the same time. The deficit would be reduced whilst public spending is increasing in real terms. That is the reality of what the Growth Commission proposed.
Question number 2, Fulton McGregor.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government how both onshore and offshore revenue varied in 2017-18 compared to the previous year.
Cabinet Secretary.
According to the latest figures, overall revenue in Scotland reached £60 billion in 2017-18, up over £3 billion on the previous year, including a £1 billion increase in offshore revenue. This growth underlines the fact that we have a productive and growing economy, despite the UK Government's London-centric economic policies. And with the limited economic powers currently at our disposal, the actions we are taking to promote sustainable economic development are helping to ensure that the key economic indicators are moving in the right direction.
Fulton McGregor.
One vitally important point I think that should be reiterated about the GERS figures and what it means for an independent Scotland comes directly from the Fraser Allender Institute, who I say, and I quote, If the very purpose of independence is to take different choices about the type of economy and society that we live in, then a set of accounts based upon the world today will tell us little about the long-term finances of an independent Scotland. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that with independence the Scottish Government can design policies that are tailored to Scotland's and not the UK Government's circumstances?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course we could, and that is the essence of what the Growth Commission was talking about, how with control around people and productivity and participation we could make a substantial difference in Scotland's economy. And of course, if we had all the levers of control, we could make different choices around, say, UK government expenditure in Scotland, defence, for example, and not invest in Trident nuclear missiles on the Clyde, as one substantial example of how we can make choices different to how the UK government choose to spend resources in Scotland. So I think it is the case that we could do better if we had more economic levers to grow our economy.
Bill Bowman.
Thank you. Offshore revenues may be up, but last year they were at their second lowest level ever, after we were told in the 2013 Independence White Paper that an independent Scotland would in fact be dependent on estimated oil revenues of around £7 billion a year by now. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell me how that prediction compares to the real figures today?
Cabinet Secretary.
But in fairness, no economist predicted the downturn in the oil and gas sector, which was international and of course affected the UK and Scotland. That has been a major contributor to the subdued performance of the Scottish economy. Now, recognising that point, is it not to be welcomed that there are signs of growth and recovery for jobs and income and revenues coming from the North Sea sector? And is it not worthy of some reflection that North Sea revenues have contributed to the Chancellor's coffers by the tune of £333 billion? Now, I think that we should continue to support the sector to ensure that growth, both offshore and the onshore supply chain, because onshore revenues in relation to these figures has increased by a substantial £2 billion over the last year.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I think that the Cabinet Secretary touched on it, but I was just going to wonder if you could advise the Chamber how much revenue is accrued to the UK Treasury at current prices from the Scottish sector of the North Sea since oil and gas were first discovered.
Cabinet Secretary.
I can confirm that that figure that I've just given of £333 billion of revenue to the UK Treasury is at today's prices, a substantial contribution to the Chancellor. And of course there is as much oil and gas, if we choose to do so, still to come in terms of barrels available if we make the right interventions around tax and exploration and innovation. But of course this is part of a wider economic strategy to grow our economy in terms of offshore and onshore.
Question number 3, Neil Findlay.
To ask the Scottish Government what impact 10 more years of austerity could have on public services in Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government has repeatedly highlighted the devastating impact that the UK Government's austerity agenda is having on Scottish families and public services, and has called for the UK Government to stop causing this unnecessary hardship. By contrast, the Scottish Government's innovative approach to income tax policy has reversed this year's real terms budget cut imposed by the UK Government, ensured that the majority of Scottish taxpayers will pay less tax than the rest of the UK, whilst continuing to provide certainty and stability for Scotland's public services. Prolonged austerity is damaging for us all, and it is vital that the Chancellor uses this autumn budget to change course.
Neil Findlay.
The SNP Cuts Commission would see an eye-watering levels of cuts of up to 11% of GDP, impacting desperately on public services. It would also see a £5 billion solidarity payment to the UK Government and introduce something called flex security, which is the ability to sack people more easily. Does the Cabinet Secretary, who is co-author of that report, does he agree and sign up to all of the proposals within it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as a member of the Growth Commission, as Neil Findlay has just referenced, and I'm very proud of the recommendations that can show how we can grow our economy, deliver a fairer society, engage around productivity, participation, for gender and inequality, and do so in a way that's good for society in the round. And I should say, in terms of austerity and continued austerity, that's a product of the union so loved by Neil Finlay. The Growth Commission rejects austerity. The deficit would be reduced whilst public spending is increasing in real terms. So the way to deliver for our society is to accelerate that inclusive economic growth, not continued austerity under successive UK governments.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the chaos that's emanating from Brexit, which Mr Finlay actually supports, actually has a devastating effect upon the Scottish public sector and the Scottish public finances, and therefore it's imperative that this Parliament actually gets the powers to help protect this country?
Well, yes, I would agree with that, Presiding Officer. I think there's a consensus that Brexit started off as a Tory gamble, then it became a guddle. Now it's just a clear act of economic self-harm, but it's harmful for our communities and our businesses and the people of Scotland and the rest of the UK, which is why we're trying to get the least worst Brexit possible, because we know just how damaging it is.
Number 4. Point of order, Ms Finlay.
Officer, I wonder what opportunity there is for members who deliberately mislead the Chamber to correct the record, and maybe you would provide some guidance on that to the member who has just spoken.
Yes, I note Mr Finlay's comments, but as he knows, all members have the opportunity to either ask further questions, written questions, or write to members who they think may not provide accurate information. Oh, Mr Finlay.
Do members have the right to tell lies about other members?
Mr Finlay is aware that language is not acceptable in this Parliament. Mr Finlay is aware that language is not acceptable in this Parliament. I would ask him to withdraw that term, please.
And replace it with the words misleading.
Secretary another chance to reconsider his answer, to ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the recent JERS figures.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
GERS provides estimates of revenue raised in Scotland and spending for Scotland under the current constitutional arrangements. We are seeing a strengthening Scottish economy. Scotland's economy grew twice as fast as the UK at the start of this year. Productivity is increasing, and the latest EY Attractiveness Survey showed that Scotland remains the top UK region for foreign direct investment projects outside London.
Edward Mount.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The JERS figures to me show that last year the union dividend delivered, as Murdo Fraser has already said, £1,882 for every person in Scotland, up from the £1,400 the previous year. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it is thanks to the ongoing cooperation of the UK Government that Scotland can continue to spend more and support more on our vital services?
Cabinet Secretary.
You know, Scotland has more than paid its way within the United Kingdom. We've contributed substantially, and the point of the work around what independence could do for Scotland is showing a path that rejects austerity, can grow our economy, can create a more inclusive society by using all the tools at our disposal. That's the kind of vision we have for Scotland, and the current notional deficit, I say again, is a product of the current constitutional position, not the opportunity that would come with Scottish independence.
Question number 5, Gordon MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the potential impact on Scotland of the UK Government's recently published technical notices to prepare for leaving the EU without a withdrawal agreement.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The UK Government's technical notices lay bare the risks facing Scottish business, the economy and the public services that would arise from a no deal. From the bureaucratic burden that will be imposed on EU imports and exports to the need to strike a wide range of no-deal deals before the end of March, these notices only add to the uncertainty and chaos surrounding the current Tory Brexit.
Gordon MacDonald.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Will he join me in calling on the UK Government again to rule out a disastrous Brexit no deal and focus instead on securing the best outcome for us all, which, short of staying in the EU, is remaining part of the single market and the customs union?
Cabinet Secretary.
There is no doubt that staying in the EU is the best option. We have constantly argued that if that option is not to be taken, then the only acceptable change would be to stay in the single market and the customs union. All opinion and research supports that, and it is extraordinary that the UK government is now in the position of talking openly about a no deal. The incompetence of that government was commented on by Mervyn King today, and I think that the incompetence should be thought about. We should think, all of us should think about that. How is it possible we have got to this stage? It can only be because what Brexit actually now is a Tory civil war.
Question number 6, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what approach it plans to reform local tax and local government finance.
Minister Kate Forbes.
The Scottish Government will set out its financial settlement for local government later this year as part of the 2019-2020 Scottish Budget and welcomes constructive engagement in that process from all political parties, including Mr Harvey's.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. The Government welcomed constructive involvement when it created its Commission on Local Tax Reform, which we all took part in good faith. One simple and easy way in which the Government could return to that stalled agenda of local tax reform is on the creation of the power for local government to introduce a visitor levy, a transient visitor levy, a tourism tax. Just to be super clear, I'm not asking the Minister whether she thinks that would be a good policy or a bad policy, but I do want to know what possible reason there is that it should be a Scottish Government choice rather than a local government choice whether or not to introduce such a tax.
Minister.
I thank the member for that question. We've made our position as the Scottish Government clear on local discretionary tax powers, but the door is open on negotiations as part of the budget process. I believe that the Cabinet Secretary has already been in touch with Patrick Harvey to take forward those negotiations, and that is the most appropriate forum for all discussions, not least on local taxation. And I don't intend to preempt those budget discussions here today.
Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On a similar note, the Minister will be aware that Edinburgh City Council voted for a tourist tax and the £11 million a year it could raise to invest in areas where tourism puts pressure on the city's infrastructure and to improve public services. I know a slight move in the government's position. Does this mean that the government does indeed have confidence that Scottish councils can establish and could deliver an effective tourist tax scheme for their areas?
Minister.
Well, the member will have heard my answer to Patrick Harvey, and if the Labour Party, along with other parties in this chamber, can come forward with credible tax proposals in terms of local discretionary tax powers, amongst other tax powers, then I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will listen to those powers. Although, from what I've seen of the Labour Party's engagements last year, finding a credible position on tax power will be difficult, but the Cabinet Secretary remains open to negotiation.
And Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister guarantee that any reform to local tax would not increase the complexity of local taxation or be used simply as an exercise to increase taxes on hard-working families?
Minister Kate Forbes.
Well, look, as part of the budget process, there are discussions between Scottish Government and COSLA on the next year's local government finance settlement, and those are already underway. The outcome will be announced later this year as part of the normal budget process. The current local government finance system is kept under constant review by the Scottish Government and by COSLA, who ensure that it continues to be fit for purpose.
Question number 7, Gordon Lyndhurst.
To ask the Scottish Government what level of engagement there has been on the Barclay implementation consultation on non-domestic rates reform.
Minister Kate Forbes.
We are consulting extensively on these important reforms. We've established the Barclay Implementation Advisory Group to advise on the implementation of these reforms, and the group includes representatives from all the key non-domestic rate stakeholder groups, including the Federation of Small Businesses, CBI, Scottish Property Federation and the Scottish Retail Consortium, along with, obviously, COSLA and the Scottish Assessors Association. The group has met 5 times since the start of the year, and its views were instrumental in the design of the current consultation document. That consultation closes on the 17th of September, and I would encourage all stakeholders to engage in that and to submit their views. My officials have continued to consult with a range of stakeholders, and the next few weeks I personally plan to meet representatives from business organisations, local authorities, sports clubs, the charitable sector and independent schools.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
I thank the Minister for that answer. It seems clear from the programme for government that the domestic rates bill will take forward in the programme for government most of the Barclay review, apart from, for example, the key recommendation that the large business supplement should be reduced and made more competitive. Is it still the intention to ignore this key recommendation, and if so, on what basis is this being picked out and chosen?
Minister.
Well, that is certainly a matter for the budget process. So again, as I've encouraged other parties to take forward and to put forward credible proposals for inclusion in the budget, I know the Cabinet Secretary's door is open to discuss things like the large business supplement. Barclay recommended that this be done only when affordable. And in the meantime, we have focused on supporting small businesses and have measures which are unique in the UK, such as the Growth Accelerator, which applies to large and small businesses to ensure that Scotland is a good place to do business.
Thank you. We're moving on now to the section on economy, jobs and fair work. Question number 1, Alex Rowley.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Scottish Government how many contracts for the manufacture of renewable technologies have been awarded to Scottish-based companies in the last 5 years, and what is the total value of these?
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The information which relates to commercial discussions between developers, Tier 1 contractors and the wide supply chain is not collected centrally by either the Scottish or UK Government, and difficulties remain in the use of standard industrial classification codes for estimation of employment impacts. However, there is increasing published evidence concerning the scale and value of renewable energy development to Scotland's economy. That comes in the form of economic impact studies capturing manufacturing activity and jobs, but also in relation to operation and maintenance, research and innovation, and environmental and other services. The Office of National Statistics have produced estimates of low-carbon and renewable energy sector jobs, with some detailed breakdown by technologies. However, these details require ongoing refinement.
Alec Rowley.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Is he aware that in the 1970s, the Offshore Supplies Office was established with the objective of securing 70% of North Sea supply chain for UK companies? Hundreds of companies provided thousands of jobs as a result. When it comes to renewables, I note the recent comments from the former Energy Minister Brian Wilson, where he said, and I quote, "As the windiest country in Europe, we should be angry and embarrassed that every single turbine around us has been imported." Can I ask the Minister, when are you going to bring forward a manufacturing strategy for Scotland? When is this government going to accept that if we're to get the economic benefits and the jobs from the renewable sector, we need the state to play a role? We need a government that will stand up for Scotland and a government that will bring jobs to Scotland.
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The two things I would want to start with are first, when Richard Leonard, Mr Rowley's party leader, was standing outside BIFAB taking selfies, it was this government that was actually helping save the business. And a little bit of recognition by Mr Rowley of the efforts that have been made by this government to support the supply chain in offshore wind would be welcome. The other thing I would like to say in relation to Mr Rowley's question is in regards to Mr Wilson, who I have respect for as a former minister. However, Mr Wilson predicted the death knell of the offshore wind industry in recent years, and he obviously was not aware of the pipeline of work which is coming forward. We now have 4 gigawatts worth of offshore wind consented in Scotland, and we are currently seeing 1.4 gigawatts of offshore wind projects under construction in Scotland, in addition to the 588 megawatt Beatrice field, which is being developed in the Murray Firth at this moment. This government takes the needs of the supply chain very seriously. Before the UK Government established the Offshore Wind Industry Council, we established the Offshore Wind Industry Group, and we have a detailed supply chain working group, which I would be happy to share details of with Mr Rowley, which works very closely with industry to maximise the supply chain benefits for the Scottish economy. And I'm happy to meet Mr Rowley any time to discuss our work in that respect.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you very much. Figures published by the Improvement Service in collaboration with COSLA earlier this week show that the number of Scottish businesses selling to their local council has almost halved nationwide over the last decade, with more and more contracts being awarded to companies based outside of Scotland. What action will the Minister take to ensure that this worrying trend is reversed?
Minister.
Renewable energy sector in particular, we are, as I say, doing work with developers and with Scottish Renewables and other key stakeholders, such as the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, to try and maximise the opportunities to develop supply chain opportunities for Scottish businesses. We do monitor quite closely, as best we can, the economic impact of projects, and there's been very useful contributions made by companies such as Scottish Power and Scottish Southern Energy, and also tidal generators such as Nova Innovation, providing detailed information about the supply chain impacts for the Scottish economy. So, is the position perfect? No, and I think the UK Government would agree with that. And clearly both ourselves and the UK Government, BEIS in particular, are working very closely together to try and maximise the supply chain opportunities for the Scottish economy and, of course, in the case of BEIS, the UK economy as a whole. So I give reassurance to the member that we take this very seriously, and developers know that economic impact is a key material consideration in planning applications as well, and we look for as much detail on the supply chain benefits in those applications when they come into us.
Question number 2, Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to improve and protect temporary and seasonal workers' rights in Edinburgh.
Mr Jamie Hepburn.
This Government is committed to fair work and wants Scotland to be a world-leading fair work nation. Scotland is the best performing of the 4 UK countries in terms of paying the living wage. We have published statutory guidance on fair work and procurement, and working constructively with the Scottish Trades Union Congress through a memorandum of understanding biannual meetings with the First Minister to promote fair work across Scotland. There is more to do, although employment law remains reserved to the UK Parliament. I have committed to publishing a Fair Work Action Plan before the end of this year, which set out the steps we will take using the powers at our disposal.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? I wonder if he's aware of the Fair Fringe Charter. It's a voluntary scheme, much like his own business pledge, which encourages employers to promote decent wages and trade union recognition. Can I therefore ask the Minister what he can do between now and next year's Edinburgh Festivals to ensure that employers pay a decent wage and look after their workers at such an important time of the year?
Minister.
Well, let me say I agree with the tenor of Ms Dugdale's question. Of course, I would go back to the point that employment law is reserved, so we can't impose these things, but on the basis of operating voluntary schemes, I'm aware of the terms of the Fair Fringe Charter. I would commend the efforts of those involved. I had the opportunity to discuss with the Better Than Zero campaign earlier this year much of the issues that have caused rise to the Charter. I have, in fact, recently corresponded with those behind the Charter. I'll be looking to better understand what it is they are seeking to achieve and how we can work together to make sure that fair work is a hallmark of the Edinburgh Fringe.
Question number 3, Colin Beattie.
To ask the Scottish Government how its investment in the £1.3 billion Edinburgh and South East City region deal will help deliver inclusive economic growth across the region and benefit residents in Midlothian, North and Musselburgh.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
The Scottish Government has committed £300 million over 15 years to the Edinburgh and South East Scotland City Region deal to support delivery of a programme of investment to stimulate inclusive economic growth and create jobs right across the city region. The deal was signed in August by the First Minister, and we look forward to working with partners in the coming years to deliver the deal. Partners will use the deal to deliver transformative impact across the whole of the city region, delivering new jobs, new homes and skills training. In addition to this, for the 2 areas that the member has highlighted, there will be direct investment. The Easter Bush campus of the University of Edinburgh in Midlothian features prominently in the Data-Driven Innovation Programme. The investment in the Food and Drink Innovation Campus will be located at Craig Hall, on land next to Queen Margaret University campus at Musselburgh. And £120 million has been committed to upgrade Sheriff Hall roundabout, delivering benefits to all users of that part of the A720 Edinburgh bypass.
Colin Beattie.
Would the Cabinet Secretary agree that Scottish Government investment will help the region continue to thrive and grow, fulfilling our ambitions for the region to be one of the fairest and most inclusive areas in the country? And can the Cabinet Secretary set out just how this Government's investment in such deals across Scotland match that of the UK Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, inclusive growth was a key consideration in the development of the Edinburgh and South East Scotland City Region deal. Our £25 million investment in the Integrated Regional Employability and Skills Programme will maximise the synergies between the different projects within the deal and equip people across the region to benefit from the additional jobs created by the investment over the next 10 to 20 years. In city region deals across Scotland to date, we have matched and in some cases we've exceeded the UK Government in our commitment to them, with the Scottish Government having committed so far to invest some £1.125 billion over the next 10 to 20 years compared to the UK Government's commitment of £1.046 billion.
Question number 4, Neil Bibby.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last met representatives of retailers in Renfrewshire and what issues were discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
Ministers regularly meet and correspond with retailers and business organisations representing businesses across Scotland, including many in Renfrewshire, as part of our ongoing engagement with business sectors. My colleagues and I have had several meetings recently to discuss issues such as business rates, town centre regeneration and the economy.
Neil Bibby.
Presiding Officer, we all know what a challenge it is to attract businesses to our town centres and support our local retailers. The Paisley 2021 campaign, driven by my community, showed a vision of what the town centre could be, but I know from speaking to local businesses in Paisley that Paisley hasn't been immune to the retail slump. What is the Scottish Government doing to support retailers in town centres like Paisley to help attract visitors? And against that backdrop, does the Minister agree with me that the decision by Renfrewshire Council to hike up parking charges by as much as 33% will only make it harder to attract visitors to Paisley and is tantamount to economic vandalism?
Cabinet Secretary.
Neil Bibby, I think, fairly referenced the City of Culture bid, which was cross-party, consensual, and I think energised Paisley and inspired confidence in the people of Paisley. And I'm tempted to do some political knockabout, but I'll resist that to say this. The town of Paisley is a very proud town, and I think it deserves our unity and our joint energies to try and ensure it is a place for the future. So what kind of measures can we take? A competitive tax environment for properties and businesses within Paisley, a focus on events and investment. And the Scottish Government will do everything we can to support that as well. But that community cohesion is really important. So let's not go back to the past in Paisley by having cheap party division on this issue. Let's stay united. Let's stay united on the big ideas that will generate Paisley and beyond, because it's that kind of vision that will stimulate the economy and the kind of attractions that there has been consensus on in Paisley that will turn the town's fortunes around.
Question number 5, Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first point the members to my register of interest as a business owner? To ask the Scottish Government what action they are taking to promote the export of goods from the South of Scotland region.
Minister Ivan McKee.
As outlined in the programme for government, we will work to boost the value and range of Scottish products, services and businesses in overseas markets. A trading nation, our plan for growing Scotland's exports will set out how we will achieve our export ambitions, working with industry and other partners, in particular the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board. The plan, which will be published in spring next year, is underpinned by over £20 million of investment over the next 3 years. As part of that work, we will invest £2 million over 3 years to intensively support 50 high-growth businesses per year to ramp up overseas activities and create 100 new business-to-business peer mentorships per year for new exporters, expand the network of in-market specialists to identify untapped potential in overseas markets and support Scotland's exporting interests, and increase export finance support for Scottish companies looking to enter new markets. These steps will benefit businesses across all parts of Scotland, including the south of Scotland.
Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you for that. At present, it seems the only support available to SMEs wishing to export is to join the Scottish Enterprise Pipeline, which then offers consultancy and market research. There appears to be no funding support for SMEs wanting to get their products in front of potential customers by attending trade shows, for example. With the new South of Scotland agency coming on stream, will the Minister look at this issue to ensure that the funding investment directly supports SMEs to grow their export markets?
Minister Ivan McKee.
As outlined in my previous answer, there's a big focus on supporting businesses, and that's all businesses, to increase their exports and to focus on 50 high-growth potential businesses per year to ramp up their overseas activities. SDI already works through Scottish Enterprise to significantly support all range of business, including export missions, and the Scottish Government in 2017 funded £400,000 to Scottish Chambers of Commerce to launch 5 local regional export partnership pilots across Scotland, including one in the south of Scotland, which includes one-to-one support through SDI's Export Advisory Service for Business and a programme of local export events across the region.
Question number 6, John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what consideration it has given to the Tyndall Centre and Uppsala University report quantifying the implications of the Paris Agreement, what role for Scotland and its implications for the economy.
Minister Mary Goujon.
The report, which was commissioned by Stop Climate Chaos Scotland and Friends of the Earth Scotland, is a report which we have considered because it already adds to the already substantial body of evidence that serious and urgent action to reduce emissions is needed. And that is why we have introduced the Climate Change Bill that has targets that are in line with the advice of our statutory advisers, the UK Committee on Climate Change. They are in line with the Paris Agreement, they're extremely stretching, but they're also feasible, and they would bring Scotland to carbon neutrality by 2050, because it's absolutely vital that we maintain a balanced approach to our climate, economic and social responsibilities.
John Finney.
I thank the Minister for that report. The report outlines the need to leave the majority of fossil fuel reserves we already know about in the ground. The Scottish Greens research paper Jobs in Scotland's New Economy outlines how hundreds of thousands of jobs can be created in a transition to a renewable-based economy. The Highlands and Islands will be integral to that transition. We've got decommissioning in Lerwick and Cromarty Firth, the European Marine Energy Centre in Stromness, and wind projects such as Beatrice. In light of this, will the Minister ensure that the communities powering Scotland's renewable energy's future get maximum benefit from employment opportunities by ensuring the proposed public energy company is headquartered in the Highlands and Islands?
Minister Mary Goujon.
I thank John Finney for that question. Now, he does raise a very important point there about the job opportunities, and that is something I think that as we transition to a low-carbon economy, there are lots of job opportunities there. And we have the Just Transition Commission we will be establishing the Just Transition Commission to help advise on delivering that transition to a low-carbon economy. In regards to where that is based in the Highlands and Islands, I'm sure that's something we can discuss at some point. But just to say that that is a very important consideration, because I think the whole aim of the Climate Change Bill is the fact that obviously we have ambitious targets, but we've got to make sure that I think the approach that we've taken is the fact that it's realistic and as pragmatic an approach as possible. And we've got to balance up all these considerations, what it means for our economy, what it means for our society, and what we do to help the climate as well. So I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary would be happy to have further discussions with Mr Finney, but this is something that we're committed to delivering and will have a very positive impact for Scotland.
Question number 7 has been withdrawn. Question number 8, Jenny Mara.
To ask the Scottish Government how many decommissioning jobs have been created in Dundee in the last 12 months.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Scottish Government are committed to maximising the economic benefits available from decommissioning and supporting Scottish industry to develop the appropriate capability and capacity to win valuable contracts. Our decommissioning action plan, supported by a decommissioning challenge fund, aims to leverage investment to ensure Scotland is in a position to capitalise on market opportunities. The Scottish Government does not hold information on specific job numbers in Dundee. However, Scottish Enterprise have provided start-up advice and support to a number of companies looking at opportunities to position themselves in decommissioning in the city. And the Scottish Government has also supported projects in Dundee through our decommissioning challenge fund, which was launched in February 2017. And this includes an investment over £500,000 in a permanently fixed heavy lift crane, which will facilitate the transfer of material to the quayside, generating cost and time efficiencies and improving the attractiveness of Dundee as a destination for decommissioning.
Jenny Mara.
I'm sure the Minister will agree with me that all these developments are very positive and wants to see the best outcome. Perhaps, if he doesn't have specific numbers in Dundee, he can give me how many Scottish jobs have been created in decommissioning in the last 12 months. Can the Minister also give the Government's backing to calls that decommissioning jobs should meet the pay rates and conditions set out in the construction sector's Blue Book? And the Minister will also know that the Tay Cities deal has not yet been signed. Would he agree with me that this agreement needs to be signed as soon as possible to bring an economic boost to Dundee?
Minister.
Well, certainly the Cabinet Secretary sitting behind me, Michael Matheson, is leading on the Tay Cities deal, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary would agree that we have tried to push the UK Government to commit to the Tay Cities deal. Share the members' aspiration that it would develop the economy, not just of Dundee, of course, but the entire city region. I'll leave it to the Cabinet Secretary to engage with the member on the detail of that. However, on the Decommissioning Challenge Fund and the wider exploitation of decommissioning opportunities, the member is right. There's up to £17 billion of value we believe to be taken from decommissioning activity in the UK continental shelf between now and 2025, much of which is already coming to Scotland in terms of well plugging and abandonment, but we are working on the shoreside disposal of topside structures from the North Sea, and we can say that the projects we have funded through DCF have already levered in a further £3.4 million from private funders. I will try and get further detail of employment impacts to the member, but we hope it has supported an estimated 200 jobs across the Scottish economy so far.
Thank you very much, and that concludes topical questions. We will now move on to the next item of business, which is a statement by John Swinney on Scottish National Standardised Assessments. And the Cabinet Secretary will, as usual, take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this opportunity to make a statement on the Scottish National Standardised Assessments. A key principle of Scottish education is that assessment is an essential part of our approach to learning. It allows teachers to understand pupils' progress and to plan the next phase of their learning and teaching. Assessment is therefore a key tool to inform teachers' professional judgment of the needs of the pupils they are teaching. Almost all local authorities in Scotland have been making use of some form of standardised assessment for a number of years. By having national assessments, we can now ensure that a consistent approach is being taken, which greatly helps in ensuring effective moderation of standards throughout the country, a crucial component of our determination to deliver excellence and equity for all. The value of assessment was set out last week by Professor Sue Ellis of the University of Strathclyde, when she said, "We know that there is a big difference in children's attainment when they start school, and that difference grows and gets wider as children move through the school system. So we do need some way of tracking that and checking it." Most councils in Scotland already had P1 assessments and have had them for some years. In fact, the majority didn't simply carry out one assessment of P1 pupils, they did it twice at different points during the year. The reason for that was teachers found them a useful source of information for tracking and checking the progress of pupils that Sue Ellis mentions, and then for planning future teaching and learning to meet the needs of individual pupils. The national assessments are simply a consistent tool to provide this same information to teachers. Unlike the old assessments, the Scottish National Standardised Assessments are better aligned to Curriculum for Excellence, making the reports that teachers receive even more valuable. On average, the P1 assessments take 22 minutes for numeracy and 27 minutes for literacy. Delivered as part of routine classroom activity, they should not place children under any undue stress. Last week, I published our user review of the assessment's first year. That drew on a range of comments and feedback, and I would like to highlight some key points. 578,000 assessments were carried out across P1, P4, P7 and S3, and I would like to thank pupils and staff for all of their efforts. This number represents around 94% of the total number of possible assessments, which I think strikes the appropriate balance between the presumption that the majority of pupils will undertake the assessments and the exercise of teacher judgment about whether it is in the best interest of an individual child to participate. The user review received a range of comments. We know that many teachers find the reports on how children have done to be very useful, with high-quality diagnostic information on the strengths and challenges of individual young people. We know that many children and young people found the assessments a positive experience because they were deployed in a relaxed way as a part of routine classroom activity. But I know that was not the case everywhere. We received clear feedback raising a number of concerns about the assessments. That feedback is a concern, particularly where the assessment of a young pupil was not viewed as a positive experience. No one wants any child to find the assessment stressful or upsetting. But in recognising that this has been the experience for a small number, and the user review does recognise the concerns expressed by EIS members and others, I think it is important to keep these matters in context. The actual number of responses to the EIS survey is relatively small, around 460 out of a total teaching population of over 51,500. And not all of those 460 responses were raising concerns. A significant number of them had positive and constructive things to say about the assessments. I'm not surprised by that. When I speak to teachers, it is clear that when the assessments are set up and run appropriately, they are a positive benefit in our education system. I accept, however, that this is the first year of a brand new system of assessments. There are clearly things that we can enhance and improve to make things better for pupils and teachers, and the user review sets out a number of positive changes that are being introduced this year. I will highlight 3 specific measures today. Firstly, the voice that is missing from the user review and the EIS survey is that of children and young people. We will address that by including at the end of each assessment a short age-appropriate survey for children and young people that will encourage them to give feedback on their experience. Secondly, we will also establish a P1 practitioner improvement forum to share existing practice and consider how to enhance the overall assessment model in Scotland. Thirdly, as we planned, there will be a replenishment of about 1/3 of the questions in all of the assessments to ensure they are appropriately assess how children and young people are performing. I'm confident that the changes we are making will enhance the experience for children and young people and improve the information available to teachers. I also want to ensure that these enhancements benefit pupils in Gaelic medium education. I have decided to only roll out national standardised assessment to Gaelic medium education once the relevant lessons from the user review are taken into account in their development. This means the assessments will be available in Gaelic medium education later this calendar year. There has also been some discussion recently about whether or not parents have the right to withdraw their children from the assessments. The Scottish Government and the Association of Directors of Education issued a joint statement earlier this week to provide clarity around this point. The Scottish Government and ADES see the assessments as an integral part of everyday learning in P1, P4, P7 and S3, delivered as part of the duty to provide education. In common with virtually all aspects of the Scottish curriculum and its delivery, the SNSAs are not explicitly provided for in legislation. This is in keeping with the long tradition of a non-statutory curricular approach in Scotland. This means that the assessments are not compulsory, but also that there is no legal right for parents to withdraw their children from the assessments. In fact, there is no statutory right for parents to withdraw their child from any aspect of schooling other than some parts of religious observance and instruction. So the position on standardised assessments is the same as it is on literacy and numeracy. There is no explicit statutory mention requiring a school to teach them, and never have had in Scotland. But the idea this means schools are not required to teach pupils to read and write is patently ridiculous. The same is true of standardised assessments. In practice, should any parents or carers have any particular concerns about their child's participation, they should discuss this with their school. It has been the case since the introduction of the Scottish National Standardised Assessments that a child should not undertake an assessment when it would not be in their best interest to do so. Rightly, it is for teachers, in discussion with parents, to determine when that is the case. This position is consistent with what we have said previously in correspondence with local authorities, schools and parents. It is consistent with our joint statement with the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, and it is consistent with the recent letter from the Deputy Director of the Scottish Government Learning Directorate to Directors of Education. In relation to that letter, I want to make clear that my officials did seek a view from SOLAR, the Society of Local Authority Lawyers, about the withdrawal of children from the SNSA to confirm that our understanding was aligned with that of local authority partners. The letter from the Deputy Director of the Learning Directorate to Directors of Education set out the position as he understood it. It was sent in good faith. The substance of that letter on parental opt-outs from the assessments is consistent with our joint assessment with ADES. It is important, as the National Parent Forum of Scotland said last week, that there is a clear understanding of the purpose of the assessments for the benefits of parents and carers. These are not high-stakes tests, but diagnostic assessments to support learning and teaching. Data from them will not be published or used for accountability. They are to inform learning and teaching. They are aligned to Curriculum for Excellence and at P1 are complementary to the play-based approach which is central to the early level curriculum. Children should not be prepared for the assessments. There is no pass or fail. They are not to determine whether a child has a mastery of a subject, but to help teachers determine future learning and teaching. Teachers' professional judgment of children's progress is key. The role of the assessments is to provide a consistent approach across the country to support our desire to deliver excellence and equity for all. Presiding Officer, I remain committed to the assessments at all stages. The changes we have announced in the user review will help improve the system to address the concerns that were raised during the first year of operation. I am confident that as we continue to refine and enhance the assessments, they will prove to be a positive experience for children and young people and provide a range of valuable information for teachers and parents.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak button, and I call on Liz Smith.
Thank you. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for making this statement about an issue which I think has caused considerable confusion to parents, and for forwarding to us the most recent letter of clarification that was signed jointly by the Scottish Government and ADES. Presiding Officer, last week a letter was sent out to local authority directors of education from the Scottish Government's Deputy Director, Graham Logan, and it stated that the Scottish Government had taken legal advice from the local authority's legal body SOLAR with regards to the rights of parents to withdraw their children from Primary 1 tests. SOLAR, however, refuted that they had provided any such legal advice, and we learnt this morning at the Education Committee that the Scottish Government admits that it had been wrong to imply that any legal advice of this nature had been taken. So may I ask the Cabinet Secretary, did he personally sign off the letter which Mr Logan issued last week, in which the misleading information appeared? And secondly, at what stage did he become aware that a mistake had been made? Thirdly, the subsequent letter to Directors of Education that has been issued this morning says that none of the standardised tests at P1, P4, P7 and S3 are compulsory, but are part of the local authority's duties to provide education. Given the Scottish Government's previous insistence that standardised testing is absolutely essential in order to raise attainment in our classrooms, a point with which I agree, may I seek clarification as to whether teachers are now free to decide whether or not a class of children will sit these tests, and whether the results of these non-compulsory standardised tests will be used as the key measure to determine whether or not the Scottish Government is making progress or not in narrowing the attainment gap.
Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, I did not sign off the letter that was issued by the Deputy Director to Directors of Education, but I take full responsibility for it because I'm a Minister in the Scottish Government and it's right that I take full responsibility for it. We did not seek legal advice from SOLAR. We discussed the legal position that we hold to, which has been consistent throughout all of the Government's communication on this matter. We discussed that with representatives of the SOLAR organisation, but as I explained at committee this morning, an error was made by in our handling of this, in that we expressed a view which we believe to have been expressed by SOLAR, but which in fact SOLAR does not express such opinions. So I can only apologise to Parliament for the fact that for the events that took place in that respect. But I take responsibility for it because I should take responsibility for it. But I stress the key point is that the substance of the message in the letter from the Deputy Director is the consistent substance of the Government's position on this matter, and it was consistent with other advice that the Government had taken at the time. In relation to the final point that Liz Smith raised with me on the issue of whether classes will take forward these assessments, I've made it as clear as I possibly can do that standardised assessments are part of the routine process of learning of young people within Scottish education, just as acquiring the skills of literacy and numeracy are part of their learning experience. So the Government's expectation is that pupils will undertake standardised assessments at P1, at P4, P7 and S3. But, as the evidence I have marshalled in front of Parliament today makes clear, not all pupils took the assessments because teachers were able to exercise judgment about whether it was in the interests of individual pupils for them to undertake those assessments. And that is as it should be, relying on teacher judgment. And the very last point that Liz Smith raised was about the information that is gathered to determine whether we are closing the poverty-related attainment gap. As Liz Smith will know, the Government set out in the publication in December last year of the National Improvement Framework the measures by which we will be held to account as to whether we have succeeded in closing the poverty-related attainment gap. Those measures relate to the identification by teachers of whether or not young people have reached the levels, at early level, first, second or third level within our education system, within Curriculum for Excellence. So standardised assessments will essentially inform the teacher judgments, but it will not. But the final publication does not rest exclusively on the outcome of the standardised assessments.
Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement. The Education Secretary clearly missed the lesson in stopping digging when in a hole. Faced with evidence of stress on 4- and 5-year-olds caused by these tests, testimony from teachers that they are time-consuming and of little educational worth, and a campaign by parents to boycott them, he carries on regardless. In P1 at least, they should be suspended. I believe that is the view of this Parliament, and I hope we will have the chance to demonstrate that as soon as possible. These tests do not command the confidence of teachers. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us how many schools have actually replaced those old and trusted diagnostic assessments they were using, as he said, and how many have simply just added his national assessments on because he told them to and they had to use them? And their purpose remains confused. The First Minister has repeatedly told us that these assessments replace the numeracy and literacy survey, that they will monitor progress in closing the attainment gap, compare school to school and authority to authority. But if they are an integral part of everyday learning, then statistically they cannot do that. So once and for all, are these diagnostic assessments or are they monitoring standards, because they cannot do both?
Cabinet Secretary.
On the last point that Ian Gray raises, the purpose of the standardised assessments is to ensure that teachers are able to use them to enhance the learning and the teaching experience of young people, to identify where young people individually have particular deficiencies and challenges and where they need support. Now, the difference between that approach and the type of survey approach that Mr Gray was arguing for over the summer is that when it comes to survey information can only give us a general picture. It cannot give us a specific picture about the needs of individual young people. And I want to make sure, and this is the fundamental issue, I want to make sure that our education system is equipped with information which is effectively moderated around the country, so that in one part of the country we can be confident that the right standards are being applied to ensure that young people have access to an education system that is driven by excellence and equity, and in another part of the country, the same guarantee can be given to children, young people and their families. So the purpose of standardised assessments is to focus on the needs of individual young people to enhance learning, but then also to give teachers confidence about the moderation of standards around the country, because only through that device are we able to have confidence that the levels of achievement are being delivered by young people, which demonstrates that we're closing the poverty-related attainment gap. So that is the purpose of standardised assessments. That's why they are vital, because they help us to inform the interventions that are required to support the learning and teaching of young people in Scotland.
Ross Greer to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and like colleagues, I thank the Deputy First Minister for advance sight of his statement. The weight of international evidence is not behind the Deputy First Minister and his standardised assessments. In the case of Primary 1 tests, it's quite clear that a majority of this Parliament want to see them go, and sooner or later that is what we're going to vote for. Will the Scottish Government just cut its losses and scrap the testing of these Primary 1 children?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I've set out my position that I remain committed to the assessments at all levels within Scottish education, because I don't want to have a situation where we don't have an opportunity, at the earliest possible opportunity in a child's formal education, to identify where that child may have particular learning challenges. And these assessments produce very sophisticated diagnostic information about the educational challenges of young people. And I want that information to be available so that at the earliest opportunity we can act to close the attainment gap. Because I don't want to preside over an education system in where the needs of children are left unmet. And Mr Greer consistently pursues the needs of ensuring that every child's needs in our system are met. And I respect his position. He argues for it consistently. And I'm simply trying to apply that in relation to this issue as well, whereby when young people come into our education system, they come into a play-based curriculum at the early level. I want to see them assessed on the basis of that curriculum. And if there are any educational requirements they have, I want them addressed pronto, so that they are not left unaddressed, and therefore the gap in their performance increases relative to other children. That's why I want standardised assessments at Primary 1. That's the educational rationale, which is supported by significant international evidence into the bargain. And that's why I ask Parliament to consider carefully the issues that I present today as being the justification for ensuring we have these assessments to protect the educational opportunities of children and young people.
Tavish Scott to be followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I too thank the Cabinet Secretary for an advance copy of his statement. I must say I profoundly disagree with the contention that testing 5-year-old boys and girls is consistent with play-based learning, and far more importantly, in my view, nor do many educationalists or experts or multi-point teachers that I can find. And I disagree, therefore, with the assessment that Mr Swinney has just given to Ross Greer. And not only that, but in the weight of evidence that he marshalled evidence early on, in the weight of evidence that we've all read on the usefulness of data, there is quote after quote after quote about whether that data actually is of any merit whatsoever. So therefore, can I politely suggest that would he not reflect on that? Would he not reflect on the fact that he hasn't carried the case in terms of 4- and 5-year-old girls and boys, and that the majority of the arguments, the majority of this case, is actually that this is not adding to teachers' experience, and more to the point, will do nothing to close the gaps that we know exist in education and desperately need to be addressed.
Cabinet Secretary.
On the final point that Mr Scott makes about whether the assessments help us in any of our efforts to close the attainment gap, I take a different view, because all of the evidence that I've looked at indicates, and this drives government policy in a whole variety of different areas around early intervention. All of the evidence that I've looked at is that the earlier we can identify any challenges that are faced by young people and address them, the quicker we are taking steps to close the attainment gap. And when I looked at the assessments when they were in their development stage, along with some teachers, and I was struck by the reaction of teachers to the diagnostic information that was presented as a consequence of these assessments, which demonstrated quite clearly areas where young people required to have support to enhance their educational performance. So the assessments are an integral part of that process of trying to address the challenges and the issues that young people will face. Now, there will, of course, be divided opinions about these points. We can all marshal a quote that says these are a good thing and a quote that says they're not a good thing. What I'm appealing to Parliament to do is to look at the role of these assessments as part of informing the improvement of learning and teaching within Scotland, with a view to ensuring that teachers are equipped with all of the information they need to have to make a judgment about the educational opportunities of children and young people. And I hope Parliament will consider these issues in the manner in which I've set them out today, because I think they represent a very strong opportunity for us to ensure that we work with our schools around the country to take all the action we can take to close the attainment gap in Scottish education.
Thank you. The opening questioners have had the opportunity to set out each of their party's positions, so I'd welcome shorter questions and appropriately shorter answers as we make progress through all the rest of the statement. James Dornan to be followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, we've heard a lot of talk about why this isn't a good idea from the opposition parties. But could you outline to us some of the suggestions you've received from these opposition parties on how we can close the stubborn attainment gap if we don't have clear and consistent evidence around our children's learning?
Cabinet Secretary.
Obviously, there are a range of different interventions that the Government is taking forward to close the poverty-related attainment gap through the work that we're undertaking on the Scottish Attainment Challenge and pupil equity funding. And various schools are taking a whole variety of different approaches to try to do that. Some by enhancing literacy and numeracy approaches, some by supporting nurture to overcome some of the challenges that young people face in their education, others by introducing outdoor learning into the curriculum and to strengthening the experiences of young people in the outdoors. Now, obviously, there's a debate to be had about the measures and the interventions we can make to close the poverty-related attainment gap. I'm interested in that debate in Parliament because it's in all of our interests to make sure that the educational opportunities of young people are fulfilled as a consequence of the actions that we take.
Alison Harris to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you. Minister, on behalf of parents, could you just clarify whether these tests, as you've previously described them in P1, are tests as we have known them to be? And where do they stand in the context of the Scottish Government being able to decide whether Scottish schools' attainment has actually improved?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the first thing is that these are called Scottish National Standardised Assessments. And they are not tests, they are assessments of the educational issues and experience of young people, which are then used to inform enhancements to learning and teaching practice. That is their purpose. From those assessments, teachers will make a judgment about whether a young person has reached early level, first level, second level or third level. And it's that information that flows into the performance framework that I talked about in my answer to Liz Smith, which will determine whether or not we are closing the poverty-related attainment gap. So teachers' judgment informs the decision about whether a young person has reached a particular level, and the standardised assessments will assist teachers in forming a judgment that is consistent across the country.
Rona Mackay to be followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary have any information or plans to gather information regarding how confident schools are in dealing with situations where parents or carers have concerns about their child taking part in these assessments? And is there any guidance for teachers from the Government on the best way to approach this?
Cabinet Secretary.
The Government has made available guidance to individual schools, which sets out that the assessment should be undertaken in a manner that's consistent with the educational experience of young people at school. So on P1 assessments, for example, the assessments should be undertaken as part of a routine approach to learning. And I saw some assessments been undertaken which were consistent with the use of iPad technology in classrooms, which for P1 pupils is a relatively routine element of the educational experience, and teachers were deploying these assessments in exactly that fashion. Obviously, if a parent is in any way concerned about their young person's experience with the standardised assessment, my advice, as it has been consistently, is that they should raise those issues directly with individual schools. And as I demonstrated with the data I set out to Parliament that 94% of possible assessments had been undertaken. The teacher judgment is being deployed to ensure that assessments are not being undertaken where young people are not, it's not appropriate for a young person to undertake that assessment. And that's us relying, as we should do, on the appropriate judgment of teachers.
Short questions, short answers, please. Mary Fee, followed by George Adam.
When discussing the pedagogic method in the Education Committee this morning, Larry Flanagan, the General Secretary of the EIS, said, if we spent half the time and energy on promoting formative assessment practice in our schools than we've spent promoting the Scottish National Standardised assessments, we'd be in a much better place in terms of assessment practice in our schools. Given Mr Flanagan's comments, does the Cabinet Secretary not agree that more support and resourcing should be given to teachers to use the pedagogic method rather than testing?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, assessments are formative assessments. That is what they are. That's what they are. They are designed to inform teacher judgment. They are not. If they were the other type of assessments, they'd be summative. And if they were summative, then they would be high-stakes testing, and that's not what they are. No. So that's the fundamental point, that these assessments contribute to teacher judgment, and teachers have been supported to deploy these assessments effectively in the classroom across Scotland.
George Adam, to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how often assessments like these were used previously? If, as he mentioned in his statement, the majority of councils were doing their own assessments previously, was that leading to different councils using different assessments and therefore creating an unclear picture of attainment levels across the country?
Cabinet Secretary.
Obviously, different forms of assessment will create will apply different standards. And what the key point about Scottish National Standardised Assessments is that they are aligned with Curriculum for Excellence levels. And Curriculum for Excellence levels are the judgments which I just answered to Alison Harris, are the judgments about whether or not we are closing the poverty-related attainment gap as part of a wider suite of information. So we need to have teacher judgment informed by these assessments to ensure we have consistent standards across the country, so that whether a young pupil is going into a school in Paisley, in Mr Adams' constituency, or going into one in Perth, in my constituency, we are operating to the same standards, so we can confidently say that we are delivering a system that is driven by the values of excellence and equity for all in all parts of the country.
Oliver Mundell, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wondered if the Cabinet Secretary could set out what he thinks are the exceptional circumstances where it wouldn't be in a child's best interest to do so. I know he places high importance on teacher judgment, but given teachers and parents didn't ask for these tests, it'd be useful to know some examples, and also if any assessment has been made of the 6% who haven't taken part this year, to understand why not.
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Mundell said, put forward the proposition that teachers and parents had not asked for these assessments. Can I remind them that the Conservative Party did? And that's rather it's rather been missed in this whole debate. So the Conservative Party were arguing for a considerable amount of time that we needed standardised assessments across the country. I don't think, well, Mr Mundell is saying not for P1. He obliges me then to say that when the First Minister set out the programme for government in 2015, she said we will introduce new national standardised assessments for pupils in primaries 1, 4 and 7 and in the third year of secondary school. And in response to that statement by the First Minister, Ruth Davidson said this: I am pleased that our repeated and sustained calls for standardised assessments to be introduced in schools have been heeded. And then the Conservative Party, in its manifesto in 2016, said, over the last Parliament, we have pushed the SNP to accept standardised testing for pupils. So I don't think Mr Mundell's in a strong position to say to me that nobody wanted these things because his party actually argued for them. But having said all of that, I think it's important that teachers are left free to exercise the professional judgment in whether it is appropriate for a pupil to be involved in standardised assessments. And the data I've shared with Parliament today makes it clear that in 6% of the possible cases, that judgment was exercised and pupils did not participate. Now, we will assess. We can certainly have a look. We can certainly have a look at that 6% and see what underlies it. But what I think it demonstrates is that the necessary flexibility that should be in a system of this type to respond to the circumstances of individual young children and young people is implicit in the system.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome the statement from the Cabinet Secretary and particularly the commitment to ensure that the voices of our young people are being heard. Can the Cabinet Secretary expand a little bit on when the Primary 1 Practitioner Improvement Forum will be established and what work it will carry out?
Cabinet Secretary.
We'll establish that during this school year to make sure that we understand and hear and appreciate and respond to the issues that are raised by P1 practitioners in their experience. Obviously, there's been a lot of experience in the first year. I've set out a number of changes as part of this statement today, which we've made recognising the experience that took place in the first year of operation. My mind is not at all closed to making further changes if they are required in response to practitioner feedback. And I would be happy to engage with members of Parliament on exactly how we take that forward to make sure that any improvements and enhancements that we can make are improvements and enhancements that the Government takes forward.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for on the statement. We've already run 5 minutes over. Apologies to Joanne Lamington and Willie Coffey. We'll be able to hear their questions. We'll move on now to a continuation of our debate on the Scottish Government's programme for government. And I would invite members who wish to speak this afternoon to press their request to speak buttons now.
For the continuation of the debate on the Scottish Government's programme for government 2017-18, I call Derek Mackay, followed by Murdo Fraser. 6-minute speeches, please.
Presiding Officer, this year's programme for government is focused on the wealth and well-being of our communities. And I relish the opportunity ahead as the Economy Secretary, having engaged comprehensively over the summer months. The PFG has a strong emphasis on boosting our economy. We will increase investment in Scotland's infrastructure, so it is £1.5 billion per year more by the end of the next Parliament than in 2019-20. This increased investment, the most ambitious long-term level of infrastructure spend that Scotland has ever seen, will drive connectivity, create jobs and deliver a long-term boost to productivity. In total, this means around £7 billion of extra infrastructure investment over the period, and it will help us support faster broadband, improved transport and more low-carbon energy. In a further transformational move, we will now embark on the legislation and capitalisation of the Scottish National Investment Bank. Today, I launched a consultation on how the bank can support Scotland's economy. We will listen to the views from across Scotland on the bank's objectives, purpose, priorities for investment and governance. And I believe this is a game changer in the provision of patient capital to finance, innovation and growth. And it will be pivotal in our ambitions for a future-proofed, high-tech and low-carbon Scottish economy. This year, we'll also...
Jackie Bailey. I've managed to have a very quick look at his consultation. There seems to be something like £30 million set aside for staffing, and the Scottish Government hasn't excluded the payment of bonuses. I wonder whether he would like to do so now.
I think it would be wrong to prejudge every element of the consultation. Naturally, we want to hear from stakeholders in that regard, but no, I will not follow the worst practices of the banking sector in that regard, and we will build a bank that Scotland will be proud of. But this year, we will begin a Reaching 100 programme delivering a £600 million investment to make super-fast broadband available to every home and business in Scotland. This will ensure that the whole country can reap the benefits of the digital revolution. And on exports, our investment for the future will make Scotland an even better place to live, work and invest, more competitive internationally and attract talent and investment from around the world. Investment at home and a determination to boost export opportunities, and that is why we're investing £20 million to help more of Scotland's businesses to engage with e-commerce for export, delivering support to existing exporters to ramp up overseas activity, and setting up a new scheme that will create business-to-business peer mentorships for new exporters to learn from established exporters. Businesses across Scotland told us they want a more streamlined business support system, and that's why we're developing a single digital point of entry for business support, along with quicker, technology-driven decisions on financial support. We're also introducing criteria now to ensure that business support grants, such as regional selective assistance, deliver on our ambition to be a world-leading fair work nation. In the coming months, our enterprise and skills agencies will also be stepping up their support for businesses to navigate through Brexit. And we move swiftly to implement the Barclay Rates Review recommendations, and will now bring forward a non-domestic rates bill to take forward the remaining legislative elements, such as moving to a valuation cycle that better reflects property values and delivers incentives for growth. Our economic actions will touch every part of Scotland. We've committed to investing over £1 billion in city-region deals, creating thousands of jobs and upskilling local labour markets across Scotland. Beyond our cities, we will legislate to establish a South of Scotland enterprise agency that supports a diverse and resilient economy in the region. And despite the UK government's Brexit bungling, Scotland's economy has proven to be resilient, benefiting from the Scottish Government's progressive initiatives. Economic growth, GDP, over the last year has been higher than in the rest of the UK, and I look forward to the opposition parties welcoming that. Youth unemployment, of course. This must be the welcome.
On that point, I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I wonder if you noticed in the Fiscal Commission's report that came out this morning, talking about this issue of GDP growth in Scotland, they said, and I quote, "These revisions don't, in our view, affect the subdued outlook for trend growth." Maybe he's getting carried away with his enthusiasm just a bit too soon.
Derek Mackay.
I'm just enthusiastic because we're outperforming the United Kingdom. That's what the... I think one is plenty for the moment. Thank you, Jackie Bailey. But economic growth outperforming the United Kingdom over the last year and the last quarter specifically. Outperforming the UK on youth unemployment in terms of reducing it, and women's unemployment is lower than the rest of the United Kingdom as well. And unemployment overall remaining at near record low levels. Scotland has narrowed the productivity gap with the rest of the UK over the past decade, and exports are up 12% in the last year. So I believe that the measures within this programme for government will deliver a step change in infrastructure and business support, delivering for the economy of today and laying the foundations for the opportunities of the future. And I look forward to that debate ahead.
I call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In her statement to Parliament yesterday, the First Minister started by talking about Scotland's economy. Sadly, there was very little actually in the programme that would help grow Scotland's economy, but let's have a look at what is on offer. Rather predictably, we heard all the usual negativity about the likely impacts of Brexit on the Scottish economy. But then, in a statement demonstrating a fairly astonishing lack of self-awareness, even for the current First Minister, she went on to trumpet the increase in the export of goods from Scotland by 12%, a significant figure. But it doesn't take an economic genius to understand that a principal reason why exports have grown so dramatically, both in Scotland and indeed across the UK as a whole, has been because of the fall in the value of the pound against other currencies over the past 2 years, and that fall is a direct result of, guess what, the Brexit vote. So the very problem area that the First Minister has identified for the economy is actually delivering the dramatic export growth that she champions. And it's not just exports that are doing well. Another sector in Scotland that is booming is tourism, to the extent that in some parts of the country we are even talking about the problem of over-tourism. Holidaying in the Highlands this summer, I was very pleased to see the very large number of overseas visitors, particularly coming from Europe, coming to enjoy our scenery, our culture and our hospitality, and all benefiting from a very favourable exchange rate. Similarly, more and more UK visitors are staycationing, taking advantage both of the good weather we've had and the more competitive costs of holidaying at home. Now, I accept the very Brexit that has created boom conditions in industries such as tourism has, of course, presented challenges. There are hospitality providers struggling to recruit staff from European countries because it is no longer so financially attractive for them to come here. And the same applies to other industries such as agriculture. But to suggest, as the First Minister did, that the impacts of Brexit thus far on our economy have all been negative is simply dismissing the evidence that we have before us. So what is in the programme for government to help the economy? Well, there is legislation to establish a South of Scotland Enterprise Agency, a policy we welcome. Indeed, a policy pinched from our manifesto in 2016. There's to be a new bill on non-domestic rates to implement some of the recommendations of the Barclay Review, and much of that is welcome. The relief for new build properties, that will help grow the economy, and property improvements, and the exemptions for day nurseries. And some of the process issues, the move to a 3-year cycle for revaluations, will also be beneficial. But it remains our view that the Barclay Review was a missed opportunity for a more fundamental review of business taxation in Scotland. And in particular, retail continues to suffer as a sector, with pressure on traditional high streets. The large business supplement set in Scotland at a rate nearly double that applicable in the rest of the United Kingdom continues to be a burden on Scottish retailers and creates a competitive disadvantage for Scottish traders, which does need to be addressed. The non-domestic rates bill will no doubt address the issue of rates on independent schools, with an intention of implementing the SNP's policy objective of removing the current exemption. And it's always seemed to me totally illogical that the same Barclay Review, which proposes a new exemption from business rates for children's nurseries which provide education, many of which both charge fees and are profit-making, at the same time proposes removing a business rates exemption from independent schools, which are charitable institutions not making a profit. It is an approach as bizarre as it is illogical. And already a real problem has developed, in that there are a whole range of independent schools providing specialist support for children with additional support needs, such as the new school at Butterston in Perth and Kinross, which will be hit with business rates unless a way can be found to exempt them. And undoubtedly it will be a significant challenge to parliamentary draftsmen to draw a distinction in law between independent schools which provide a general education, but with some pupils with special needs, and for those schools which are set up almost exclusively for pupils with those needs. This is not just an issue about education, it's also an economic one. In Perth and Kinross, there are at least 8 independent schools I'm aware of, having a significant economic contribution to the local economy, supporting around 500 direct jobs and many more indirectly in the wider economy. And it's a major earner, of course, of foreign revenue from students coming from overseas. To hit this important economic sector with a new tax burden flies in the face of everything we've been told by this SNP government. To quote directly from the First Minister yesterday, she said this: "We will ensure that the business environment in Scotland..." Let me just finish this quote and I'll give way. We will ensure...
In the last minute, it'll have to be very quick.
We will ensure that the business environment in Scotland remains competitive and that we're providing the support that businesses need to thrive. Not these businesses, it sounds like. I'll give way.
Derek Mackay.
I ask Mr Fraser, is he aware of the proportion of non-domestic rates relief as a proportion to the overall running costs for an average independent mainstream school?
I don't have the figure at the tip of my finger. What I can say is to add an additional burden, I think we're talking about an aggregate £5 million, to a sector that is important both educationally and economically, flies in the face of everything else this government has said about growing the economy. But it seems the Education Secretary, who I'm afraid has now left the chamber, does recognise the issue, because he wrote over the summer on behalf of constituents to the Finance Secretary, raising these concerns. And what was the Finance Secretary's response? To suggest that the local authority, Perth and Kinross Council, could somehow find the money in their budget, a budget he and his predecessor have slashed, to make up the difference. Presiding Officer, we've had to sit in this chamber month after month, year after year, while SNP ministers complain they have to use their resources to mitigate the policy choices of a Westminster government on welfare and elsewhere. And yet here we have SNP ministers having the brass neck to play exactly that same trick on local authorities that they claim Westminster is playing on them. Was there ever anything quite so shameless, Presiding Officer? In conclusion, I think this is an unambitious programme for government. It's indicative of a party in government running out of ideas, lacking in enthusiasm and short on ambition. It really must do better than this. Thank you.
Call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been an interesting opening observation from the Conservative benches. It's the first time I've heard someone like Murdo Fraser boasting that the pound in his pocket is worth less than it was before Conservative policies and actions affected it. And I welcome what he'll say in 2 years' time, when the effect of higher costs for importing components that are required for manufacturing industry in these islands will really hit home. Short-term benefit, long-term much more problematic. But Brexit is something that we should talk about in terms of the economy. It's a huge challenge to the Scottish economy, to the economy in these islands. But the one thing it will not do is inhibit this government in taking the actions that will support Scotland's further development from here on. I want to just say a few words about a few of the things in yesterday's statement from the First Minister. Before talking about banking, I remind people of my register of interests in relation to banking. I, of course, spent 30 years in banking and came into politics to improve my reputation. The Scottish National Investment Bank is something I very much support. The world of finance and of cash and of the way it works is fundamentally changing for businesses, but even more so it will for individuals. For example, in Sweden, there are now only 25 bank branches in Sweden who deal with cash, because essentially it's become a cashless society. We'll get there as well. And I think the Scottish National Investment Bank, primarily focusing on investment in the first instance, could look in the longer term at how we can support communities who are going to lose, as they are already, more and more local branches, so that the right kind of financial services there. And that often will be through technology assisted by trained people. So I hope the Investment Bank might, in the long term, look at that. The biometrics bill I very much welcome. I encourage the government to take close attention to what's happened in India with the Aadhaar system, which is an identity card system which has got 1.22 billion cardholders issued since 2009. Important point about it is that 50% or so of the cardholders are functionally illiterate. So therefore, it's an easy access system. It has many lessons for the sort of things that we might want to do in relation to biometrics. The Aadhaar card is based on retinal scan. A wee thing about electoral reform. I hope that we can persuade the Electoral Commission, when they're doing boundary changes, to perhaps give us more granular details so we can see what houses there are at the edge of our constituency. Not a big deal. On non-domestic rates, one thing I'd like the government to work with the assessors on is how they factor in empty premises into the assessment of value of rent. Because in the northeast of Scotland, fish factories, and there are quite a lot of them, are empty. But those that are not empty, they're taking the actual rents paid. But no account is being taken of the fact that it's impossible to let other factories at the rate of rent that the ones that are occupied. So it should be across the board, and the valuers do know about the empty factories because they're looking at them as well. And that's a wee thing. And I'm going to be talking to valuers about it, because I realise the government does not control that subject, but it does provide guidance. Now, on infrastructure, I very much welcome the increased investment that is going to be in infrastructure. I hope that we'll think about whether we can support industries that are going to be particularly hard hit by the absence of people from across Europe, because people are going to go back to Europe because of the immigration rules, and perhaps help the fish processing industry increase its levels of automation, perhaps help the soft fruit industry develop new technologies for harvesting, and of course, in turn, creating new products that we can sell around the world. So I hope that these are things that the infrastructure investments might include in the consideration of things they want. But of course, it's up to the industry to come forward with proposals, and I have been talking to people in both these industries about what they might do in that regard. Now, that's middle term to long term, maybe not immediately short term, but nonetheless important for that, Presiding Officer. Now, I want to, if you'll allow me, Presiding Officer, since there's no motion, to just pick up one thing that is not economy directly, which I'm particularly interested in, and that is the announcements in relation to mental health. In 1964, for 8 months, I personally worked in mental health as a nurse. My father-in-law is a psychiatric nurse, my sister-in-law is a psychiatric nurse. So I'm absolutely clear about the value of investing in people's mental health. Diminishing in schools these early signs of mental ill health that might develop into a real, coming back to the economy, cost to the economy, but more fundamentally, something that will benefit people in Scotland, improve their lives, not just simply their wallets. Presiding Officer.
I call Jackie Bailey to be followed by Andy Whiteman.
Presiding Officer, I have to confess that the First Minister's programme for government sounded to me like a bit of a shopping list. There was no story, no consistent thread underpinning what the government was doing. I left not really knowing what the big picture was. Lots of inputs, but very little on outcomes. And when you look back at the previous programme for government announcements, the charge that the SNP overpromise but underdeliver is absolutely true. Only 2 bills passed last year. And if it was based on performance-related pay, ministers should have their salaries docked. But it's not just about legislation, I accept that. It's also what you do with policy and with the budget. The problem is that the SNP has been timid on all of those fronts. Every measure, every target which the government set for itself on the economy, it has failed. Just look at the 7 purpose targets that relate to the economy. Not one of them met. So let me welcome the renewed focus on the economy, because I've no doubt it is badly needed. I particularly welcome the announcement that there will be a new economic strategy, and not before time. Scottish Labour has asked for the economic strategy to be reviewed several times. We asked the First Minister, we asked the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, we did so in 2015, in 2016, in 2017. You would think that Brexit was a sufficiently material and significant change that they would want to make sure that their strategy was fit for purpose. But oh no, on at least 3 occasions, the SNP voted against a review. So I am really glad that the new Cabinet Secretary does not have his head in the sand like his boss or indeed his predecessor. The second issue for me is honesty. Honesty about the state of the economy. Now, of course, the government will claim that everything is wonderful. The opposition will claim that everything is dire. The truth is, our economy is fragile. Look, I think everyone in this chamber would welcome any rise in GDP down rises that are fractions of a percentage point because it is marginal. Forecasts by the Fiscal Commission show growth at less than 1% for a year longer than they originally thought, to 2023. That's not a good story, and I want us to do much better than that. And let me say as gently as I can to the Cabinet Secretary, if the limit of our ambition is to just compare ourselves to the UK when the UK itself is performing badly, that's not very clever, nor is it very ambitious. So let me make progress and then you can come in. So let's compare the state of the Scottish economy to some of our European neighbours. Because I remember the SNP used to talk about emulating the Celtic tiger. That was until the Irish economy tanked. But from 2015 to the first quarter of 2018, Ireland has outperformed Scottish GDP growth in 11 out of the 12 quarters. How about Spain, where the Great Recession... You see, I hear somebody shouting independence. Actually, no, this was about a significant recession, and what they did themselves didn't require independence. It required determined effort. And how about Spain? Let's talk about Spain and the Great Recession, which lasted until 2015. Unemployment was at 20%. Now Spain is outperforming Scotland in each and every one of the 12 quarters. And in Portugal, where unemployment reached 18% and the European Central Bank had to intervene, their growth was higher than Scotland's in each of the last 12 quarters. Now, it's interesting to note that there is a socialist government in Portugal that has explicitly rejected austerity and is turning their country round. I invite the SNP to learn a lesson or two from Portugal. I am encouraged by the new focus on exports. There has been too little done in this area in the past. I would also note that we export more to the rest of the UK than we do to the rest of Europe and indeed the world. So strengthening our home market is as important as looking further afield. But where is the focus on productivity? A key driver for economic growth, no mention of it in the First Minister's 45-minute speech. Productivity in Scotland is woeful. The government had a target of lifting productivity to the top quartile of OECD countries to be achieved by 2017. We started at 18th place in the second quartile. And when we got to 2017, we had slipped to 19th place in the third quartile. Frankly, that's dreadful. Where to is the focus? Absolutely.
Derek Mackay.
Jackie Baillie has rightly said that we shouldn't try and just match ourselves to UK performance. Of course, we're outperforming compared to the rest of the UK. But when we've looked at small, advanced economies that are more successful than Scotland, we have all the economic fundamentals that they have. The one thing that they've got that we've not is independence. Why does Jackie Baillie stand in the way of our economic progress?
Jackie Baillie. The interesting thing, because your Cuts Commission report actually spelt it out in terms. With independence comes years of austerity, eye-watering cuts to public services, cuts to schools and hospitals. That's why we reject your flawed notion of a thriving economy. But where is the focus on workers? Much of the recent rises in employment, I think you'd acknowledge, have been characterised by temporary working, by low pay, by zero-hours contracts. A report just the other day highlighted the millions that would be injected into the economy in the west of Scotland and Glasgow in particular if more people were on the living wage. I welcome too the 8th re-announcement of the Scottish National Investment Bank. I'm disappointed that there is a suggestion that they're going to pay bankers bonuses, and I hope that's not the case. Of course, under Scottish Labour's plans, we would see £20 billion invested, 10 times the amount the SNP is proposing, because we need to see transformational change. And finally, presiding officer, on infrastructure investment, Scottish Labour have been asking for SFT to be reviewed for many years to secure better value for money. We would deliver £20 billion in capital investment from a national transformation fund, in contrast to the SNP. And let me just finish on this point. The Scottish Government has new borrowing powers of £450 million each year. How much of that will be used to fund the £1.5 billion announced? How much will come from the private sector? And how much is assumed investment made by local authorities? We look forward to considering this and the funding model in further detail.
Can I remind members they should always speak through the chair and not directly to each other? And I call Andy Whiteman to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. It's worth reflecting, I think, as Richard Leonard did yesterday, that next year is the 20th anniversary of this Parliament, and despite our political differences, it's worth celebrating the fact that we actually do have the capacity here in Scotland to introduce new laws and policy for the people we serve. Examples of welcome legislation in the programme for government include bills on consumer protection, electoral reform and family law, as well as the announcement that I welcome that government will introduce a bill in this Parliament for reform to the law of defamation. I commend Scottish Pen and others on their campaigning on this matter. And in policy terms, we welcome, as many others have, plans for a Scottish National Investment Bank and the launch of the consultation today, something which could have a transformative impact on the economy if designed and implemented appropriately. We welcome too ambitions for infrastructure investment, but reiterate our previous calls for this to be focused on low-carbon projects, public transport and public housing. Today's debate is themed around the economy, and as a number of speakers have mentioned, we continue to have fundamental problems with the economy. As Greens, we have fundamental problems with the assumptions underpinning the government's economic policy. Economic growth, even inclusive economic growth, is a fundamentally flawed goal if measured by GDP, the aggregate of monetised transactions in the economy. The founder of GDP in the 1930s was Simon Kuznets, who became one of its biggest critics. GDP does not measure goods and services produced in the course of daily life, does not measure the distribution of income or wealth, says nothing at all, in fact, about wealth, ignores environmental services from soils, oceans and forests, and says nothing about energy flow. The idea that GDP growth is central to the measurement of the success of an economy is, in the words of one of the authors of the 1972 Limits to Growth report, one of the stupidest purposes ever invented by any culture. And yet it persists, and Scotland's economic policy will be deemed a success if, for example, the oil and gas sector continues to extract more hydrocarbons, despite the imperative to leave the vast majority of known reserves in the ground. Now, the economy of Scotland, like... I will...
who are you taking, Mr Whiteman?
Sorry, Mr Arthur.
Tom Arthur.
Yes. I'm very grateful to Mr Whiteman for giving way. I just wonder, notwithstanding the points he makes, many of which I'm sympathetic to, he would concede that there is a correlation between per capita GDP and human well-being.
Andy Whiteman.
There certainly is an indication that there's that correlation, but it's not the basis on which we need to build a sustainable economy, because that correlation is not absolute. Now, the economy of Scotland, like the wider UK economy, is still too heavily weighted in favour of financial services, dangerously dependent on consumption, which continues to be fuelled by high levels of household debt, with a generation of young people facing excessive housing costs, job insecurity and lower living standards. Today, the Institute of Public Policy Research published the final report of its Commission on Economic Justice. It contains some of the ingredients for a successful economy, and I would welcome the Government's response to the recommendations for Scotland. Green politics is based on the 4 pillars of equality, peace, environmental sustainability and radical democracy. And in our view, to secure the changes the economy and society need, people need the power to make those changes. Across Europe, cities and municipalities are leading the way in sustainable transport, clean air, affordable housing and tackling climate change. They do so, by and large, because they have the legislative and the fiscal power to do so. They are drivers of economic activity, innovation and sustainable futures. And that's why it is so disappointing to see the programme for government perpetuate an unambitious agenda to reform the way Scotland is governed at a local level, to provide a more local and participative local democracy with a commensurate fiscal powers to create genuine local autonomy. Quarter of a page out of 118 on the local government's review, with no ambition or ideas about how Scotland can become a normal European country in respect to how we're governed locally. Modest proposals for a tourist tax, commonplace across Europe, kicked further down the road, although welcome confirmation from Kate Forbes this morning that such powers will be considered as part of budget negotiations. Presiding Officer, a critical part of economic policy is taxation, and the programme makes reference to them on page 61. And given the second highest yielding tax in Scotland is non-domestic rates, we welcome the proposal for a bill on this matter. However, the thorough and comprehensive review of the whole business rate system promised by Derek Mackay as far back as 2013 was never delivered. Instead, we had the Barclay Review, which asked one question and was told to make its recommendations revenue neutral. That meant in practice that any proposals that were made to reduce liabilities in any sector had to be balanced by measures that would make up for the lost yield, and that's why we have some of the proposals to raise liabilities in those other sectors. This is not the way to do tax reform. Presiding Officer, earlier this week we lost the Nobel Prize winner, Professor James Mirrlees. He was one of the Scottish Government's economic advisers. And in his Mirrlees review of 2011, a comprehensive look at the tax system, he said, amongst other things, that, and I quote, "The business rate is not a good tax. Taxing non-domestic property is inefficient and should not be part of the tax system. The economic case for taxing land itself is very strong," he said, however. And on stamp duty, he said there is no sound case for maintaining stamp duty and we believe it should be abolished. Presiding Officer, the Government might ignore these wise words from one of its own advisers, but Greens won't. And we look forward to working across the Chamber to secure the changes, to some of the changes that he advocated to fiscal policy. And we also look forward to working with the Government and with other parties to take forward some of the very good ideas in the programme for government. Thank you.
Call Liam MacArthur to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you. It was interesting, Deputy First Minister, listening to the First Minister deliver her statement yesterday, partly, and I'll come to this in a minute, in terms of what she had to say, but also because of the way it seemed to be received on her own backbenches. Those of us who've been in this Parliament over the last 11 years have got used to the raucous adulation that normally greets such first ministerial set pieces. The oh-so-spontaneous rounds of applause in response to carefully crafted clap lines, the pantomime of booing of those deemed unworthy of the people of Scotland. Not so yesterday. It was all rather muted, all a bit low-key, all something of an anticlimax. That's not to say, that's not so. It's all behind me. That's not to say, of course, that there weren't positives in what the First Minister had to say. Things I warmly welcome. Guaranteeing the voting rights of EU citizens in this country was an early and obvious example. So too confirmation that the principles of the UNCRC are to be incorporated into Scots law. I was on the Education Committee in the last session when the Government used its parliamentary majority to frustrate any attempts of moving in that direction during consideration of the Children and Young People's Act. But this rethink by the First Minister is nevertheless welcome, it's significant and it's potentially far-reaching. The same description applies to the additional funding announced yesterday for mental health, coming on the same day as figures showing the staggering scale of how far we currently are from meeting the needs of those of all ages, but particularly of children and young people suffering from poor mental health, only serve to underscore how vital that long overdue investment is. It must now prompt a substantial increase in training of specialist practitioners. Just expecting teaching profession to pick up the pieces won't do, and ensuring improvements in provision are felt across the whole country, including in rural and island areas, will also be essential. But, as I say, the funding announced yesterday lays a good platform and must now pave the way for treatment of mental ill health to be put on the same statutory footing as physical ill health. So positives, Deputy Presiding Officer, in what Nicola Sturgeon had to say yesterday, but sadly too few in a statement that went on for 40 minutes or more. Not that I was desperate to hear her going on any longer, but I was struck by some of the bills that were conspicuous by their absence. The Good Food Nation bill appears to have been boiled down to a mere programme. Richard Lockhead may be back in flavour of the month with the First Minister, but the bill he spent so much time evangelising has been dumped in the compost bin. With major challenges in food poverty, child obesity and even biodiversity loss, it's hard to understand why the Government has scaled back its ambitions in this area. No sign either of the much-needed crofting reform bill to address growing frustration and anger at current regulation that is not fit for purpose and is actually holding back individuals, businesses and communities, including in places like Orkney. Missing in action too was any mechanism for undoing the mess the Government has got itself into in dismantling the British Transport Police. These are just some of the examples of where the First Minister's programme for government fell short and represents a missed opportunity. We did, though, get some signs as to what we might expect from the Government's forthcoming budget bill, though we'll have to wait a bit longer for the full reveal. For now, in the remaining time available, let me gently remind the Finance Secretary of other commitments he has made and that will also need to be accommodated when that bill is brought forward. Much was made yesterday of plans for investment in infrastructure, repeated again by Mr Mackay, yet it was difficult to identify much of direct relevance to more rural and island areas. Last year, of course, the Scottish Government finally agreed to begin honouring the promises it had made through successive transport ministers, including Mr Mackay himself, on funding for Orkney and Shetland's internal ferry services. That principle has now been accepted. There cannot be any rowing back, and any attempt to do so would be seen by those in Orkney and Shetland as an act of betrayal on the part of this government. I'll take a brief intervention.
Stuart Stevenson.
Will the member agree with me that a huge majority of the 600 million that will be invested in the Reaching 100% Coverage broadband programme is directed at rural areas? I will be a personal beneficiary. I'm looking forward to it.
Liam MacArthur.
I absolutely agree, although I think there are serious questions about the deliverability in parts of my constituency, and I appreciate the engagement there has been through the Digital Scotland team in trying to answer those questions, but questions and serious questions still remain. So the principle has been accepted. At the same time, however, there was a recognition that the current arrangement for running those ferry services is not sustainable. I was pleased that the Finance Secretary accepted at the same time the need for urgent action on a longer-term solution. In Orkney, this means replacement vessels. The current fleet is no longer up to the standards of operating many of these routes. The boats cost more to run, more to fix and more to keep at sea. Delays in replacing them is increasingly a false economy, one that comes at a cost to the communities that rely so heavily upon them. The new Transport Secretary must now get round the table as a matter of urgency with the local council and agree a programme for fleet replacement. This is being done on the West Coast, where we see multi-million-pound vessels at least being procured, even if the building and delivery is not necessarily going according to plan. The recent passing of the Islands Act is not job done. Communities like the ones I represent expect this to be backed by action, including action on infrastructure investment, such as our Lifeline ferry services. In passing, I would also urge the Government to sort out the mess over road equivalent tariff for Northern Isles ferry routes. I appreciate the dispute with Pentland ferries is not entirely of their making, but the deafening silence from ministers over the summer is not encouraging. Those travelling between Orkney and Shetland and the Scottish mainland are still being forced to pay over the odds for using these services. That, Deputy Presiding Officer, cannot be allowed to continue. Thank you.
We'll have to be a wee bit stricter with time from now on. So John Mason, followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very happy to be speaking this debate at the start of the new parliamentary year. Can I just say to Liam MacArthur that some of us do not do raucous adulation at all. I have to say that I think this programme for government looks very positive to me, and it seems to me that it is building on last year's plans. Last year, one bill I was heavily involved in was the Islands Bill, and I think some opposition members have suggested that we could push through more bills, or we could push through bills faster, and perhaps the present system is too slow. But I think when we look at that bill, the government did a lot of work in preparation for it. The REC Committee, which I'm a member of, spent a huge amount of time, both here and out visiting on the islands, to take that through. We did some of that during recess, and we also did a lot of good input from all 6 councils that were involved. So I have to say I would be very reluctant for us as a parliament to churn such bills through faster and end up with some more kind of slapdash approach, such as they have at Westminster. Now, I'm particularly interested in the economy being a... Absolutely, yes.
Bruce Crawford.
I wonder if the member would remember during the period from 2011, when the SNP were majority government, the number of times opposition complained about the amount of legislation it was pushing through Parliament when it could.
John Mason.
Yes, that's a fair point, and clearly the opposition say one thing one day and another thing another day. Now, I'm particularly interested in the economic side of things, and the idea that there's going to be more focus on infrastructure strikes me as extremely good. That can mean more jobs. And just yesterday, the Economy Committee, for example, we were hearing that GVA in the construction sector was £52,900 per head in 2016, which is higher than for many other sectors. So that is a good place to be investing in. At the same time, I think we have to accept that there has been a tradition for construction jobs to go to men. And so we do need to continue challenging such gender stereotypes and break down some of these traditional barriers in society. As yet, we have not seen the detail of how all this extra money will be allocated, So as others probably put their bids in, as co-convener of the Rail cross-party group, I would just like to say that I would be very happy to see more money spent on rail. For example, the Perth-Inverness line is an opportunity and also a challenge. Dualling the A9 is absolutely great and fabulous, but a side effect could be putting rail travel at a disadvantage, and so hopefully that might be one of the kind of areas that the Cabinet Secretary would look at. Now, thinking about the economy, we also think about what the other two main parties look at and the way they view the economy. First of all, we have the Conservatives. Now, they would like us to think that they are the realistic party. They realise that we have to live within our means. Expenditure cannot outstrip income year after year, and they want to see growth and an increase in productivity. Now, many of these things I can agree with, but there is a problem with the Conservative vision for the economy. They do not seem to care how the growth comes about, and they do not seem to care who suffers in the process, as long as the economy grows. So if the rich get super rich and the poor get super poor, that would still be success in the Conservative world, as long as the economy is growing. Then, on the other hand, we have Labour. They do not do realism. Richard Leonard and Jeremy Corbyn are probably well-meaning people in a bumbling sort of way. They would just say that we should spend more and more and more. They do not really have a plan as to where that money would come from. Perhaps they'll start a new tax tomorrow or raise an old one. But why bother planning about these things? No, I don't think so, from Mr Finlay. Yes, absolutely. Or perhaps we could just borrow and borrow and borrow, and hopefully one day someone will repay it. Now, in contrast to these two flawed models, we have a party of government, the SNP, whom the people of Scotland clearly trust because we have been here for 11 years. Now, it is a challenge to be in government and to be forced to be realistic but also aspirational at the same time. It seems to me that this programme for government strikes a good balance between being more progressive than the UK has been, raising income taxes a bit more, investing for the future, but at the same time being realistic about what we can borrow and afford to pay back in the future. Now, clearly, Brexit is a huge aspect of any programme for the coming year, and it has been mentioned by a number of speakers. I think many of the public and many of us are getting fed up with the endless bickering at Westminster and the myriad of potential scenarios. And perhaps our Conservative colleagues could tell their London masters that it is about time we had some definite plans and actions, and not just contradictions, claims and counterclaims. One of the Conservatives' favourite lines seems to be that Scotland does more trade with the UK than with the EU, perhaps 61% for the UK, 17% or thereabouts with the EU, and that is well and good, that is true. But the idea from the Conservatives that we can just forget about that 17% and presumably take a 17% hit on our economy is absolute madness. Scotland cannot afford to lose either of these important markets, the EU or the UK. Our farmers, our fishing boats, our business people need both. We need both the UK market and the EU market. So would the Conservatives please put the country's interest ahead of their narrow party squabbles? On population and immigration, it was Jack McConnell, I think, who really led in a lot of this, that we cannot grow the economy if we are not allowed to have a growing population. And that is absolutely key if we want to grow our internal markets, grow our taxpayer base and grow our workforce. On the budget, could I just say that I hope this is an opportunity for the opposition parties to think about whether they will constructively engage in the budget, whether they will sit down and seek to reach a compromise. This is a minority government in a parliament with proportional representation. We all need to compromise. No one will get exactly what they want. And I would appeal to both Labour and the Tories to think a bit more seriously than they have in previous years.
Thank you. That's fine, Mr Mason. I call Liam Kerr to be followed by Emma Harper. Mr Kerr, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, I've not had the chance to formally welcome the new Cabinet Secretary for Justice to his role yet, and I'm pleased to do so, both in general and in the context of the programme for government. Some may consider his inheritance as something of a poisoned chalice, with violent crime up, drug crime up, robbery up, detection rate down, and that in a context of police officer numbers, which have been cut to a 9-year low. It would be a big ask for anyone to pick it up cold, let alone someone from a completely separate brief. Which is why I want to reiterate Ruth Davidson's point yesterday and encourage the new Justice Department to work with those who do have that experience and the policies. The early signs are promising. Unlike his predecessor, who, in the face of repeated criticism from the Scottish Conservatives, the train operating companies, the trade unions, most other opposition parties and the public, railroaded through the unwanted, unnecessary and dangerous BTP merger, but the new Cabinet Secretary has climbed down. Although, oddly, railway policing is not mentioned at all in the programme for government. The programme for government also makes an unequivocal, unambiguous promise to introduce Finn's Law. Clearly, the Finn's Law campaigners, a petition with 40,000 signatures, the correspondence from the kids at Mosnuke Primary School, a members' business motion with cross-party support, and my demands on Monday that it be included in the programme for government worked. Then there is restorative justice. In this debate last year, I said that the government should introduce a genuine programme of restorative justice to tip the balance back in favour of victims who too often experience a justice system that offers them nothing. Indeed, I led a members' debate on it around 6 months ago. The result? A commitment to publish a restorative justice action plan by spring 2019. Good. We demanded a commitment to crack down on drug driving, and I welcomed last year's programme for government, which promised to implement this one. Unfortunately, the SNP are still yet to lay the statutory instrument to get it done, but at least, like many other aspects of last year's programme, the commitment has been reheated, which is welcome. But there is much in the Justice Brief which is less encouraging. I noted the Cabinet Secretary's recent statement in a magazine that victims' rights will be strengthened. Well, the programme for government doesn't do it, because the measures for victims announced fall far short of what is required. Bluntly, it offers to ensure victims and their families have better information and greater support ahead of prison release arrangements. But there is no commitment to give victims and families any meaningful input. Victims and their families have asked that their safety and welfare is explicitly required to be taken into account. They have asked for the increased use of exclusion zones on offenders, and that the victim notification scheme is revised so they are given reasons for release and can make representations in person. That is meaningful input into a process that currently treats victims as little more than an afterthought. That is Michelle's Law, and that will form the subject of my members' debate tomorrow, to which I very much look forward. Two final points. Yet again, the ill-thought-through extension to the presumption against custodial sentences from 3 to 12 months has reared its head. Look, I understand the SNP want to save money by emptying our prisons, but compromising the safety of the people of Scotland by allowing serious criminals out onto the streets is not the solution. Last year, 10,000 offenders were sentenced to 12 months or less in prison. That figure includes 2 convicted of homicide, 99 of serious assault or attempted murder, and 60 of robbery. This plan will let some of the most dangerous criminals back out into society and make life even more miserable for victims of crime across Scotland, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
Giving way, his UK Government colleague, the Minister for State for Prisons, Rory Stewart MP, said just yesterday, it is of course true that we have evidence that shows clearly there is a higher incidence of reoffending from people in short prison sentences than from people who serve community sentences. That is why the example from the Government of Scotland is very relevant. Is he also similarly critical of his UK Government counterpart?
Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, isn't it interesting how the SNP are so focused on what's happening in England and Wales? It is almost as if they don't know we have a separate justice system. I'm interested in Scotland's justice system, and from the evidence we have, it is clear that the SNP's community sentence model, as currently constructed, is not working. And the Cabinet Secretary also brought up Rory Stewart. I'll take this opportunity to remind him, Rory Stewart also said, if I haven't sorted out the prisons within a year, I will resign. I look forward to a similar promise coming from this Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, finally, prisoner voting. I note that the reference to consulting on this is buried in 2 separate pages out of 118, comprising 8 words each. Now, I'm not surprised that the SNP is a bit embarrassed about giving this any profile. The SNP has been criticised for being too distracted by its own troubles to deal with the things that really make a difference to communities. Well, here is a great example of exactly that. A consultation about a reform which is unworkable, unwanted and not morally justified. A consultation which is a waste of time because when prisoners are sent to prison, they surrender their right to choose the government. And a consultation which is little more than an insult to victims and their families. The SNP needs to get back to the day job and start putting victims and communities first. And I look forward to helping the Cabinet Secretary retain that focus. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Emma Harper to be followed by James Kelly. Ms Harper, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in and welcome today's debate on the programme for government. And I absolutely endorse the programme set out yesterday by the First Minister. And today I'd like to focus my comments on two key aspects of the programme, one health and one economy related. The first is the announcement of the additional £250 million for mental health investment. This investment will deliver 350 dedicated counsellors in schools and an additional 250 school nurses, and it will also fund an additional 80 counsellors to work in further and higher education, as well as there will be extra funding for teachers. This objective of the investment is to provide our young people and their families with a high standard of emotional and mental health support, guidance and advice, which will enable them to effectively and efficiently proceed with their education. I'm focusing on the issue of mental health, firstly as a nurse and a former clinical educator, but also as a member of the Health and Sport Committee and as new convener of the cross-party group of mental health, along with colleagues James Dornan and Annie Wells. I'm extremely proud to support a government which has not only taken the issue of mental health seriously, but which is the first government in the UK to have a dedicated mental health minister. And I wish Claire Haughey well in her new role. Additionally, I look forward to seeing the outcome of scrutinising progress of the implementation of the programme. Just before recess, I sponsored a Scottish eating disorder interest group reception here in Parliament, and we heard many inspiring stories from experts, parents and, most important, those living with an eating disorder. And one of the key messages from those attending the SEDIG event was that it's key to receive diagnosis and treatment early so that the most effective management and recovery can occur. So I would like to ask the Scottish Government to consider supporting, including an approach to addressing eating disorders for the young people who may be experiencing a disorder which might negatively be affecting their health, including diabulimia. The second point I'd like to focus on specifically relates to my South Scotland region, and that is the creation of the South Scotland Economic Partnership, led by Professor Russell Griggs, ahead of the legislation announcement yesterday by the First Minister to create a South Scotland Enterprise Agency. The South Scotland Economic Partnership has been operational over the past 12 months, and the board members have been holding engagement meetings across South Scotland, and there has been strong engagement and interest. The development and ultimate sustainability of the economy and indeed economic development of the South region, as I am pleased to report that these meetings have been well received with predominantly positive feedback from the people attending. Whilst the South Scotland Enterprise Agency is absolutely crucial to support investment to the South's economy, we must also recognise that digital, road and rail infrastructure is also key to attracting business, tourism and people to the South. That's why I'm happy that in the programme for government there is a commitment to improving infrastructure of the South of Scotland. This includes commitment to carrying out and implementing major infrastructure projects across the region. This includes the Maybole Bypass and broadband, and also publishing the South Scotland Strategic Roads and Rail Review. I look forward to this review, which is currently underway, and it will identify, hopefully, infrastructure projects that are required across the South region and inform the projects going forward. I will continue to lobby the Government for investment on the A75, 76 and 77 with my colleagues Jean Freeman and Joan McAlpine, and I look forward to future announcements regarding these major arterial routes which are necessary for business, tourism and daily travel. I'd like also just to make one final point. Whilst attending the agricultural and cattle shows over recess, I took the baby box on tour. The chance for folks to look inside and get in about the contents proved worthwhile. There were many positive comments, And in the southwest of Scotland, apparently there's been about 4,000 baby boxes that have been delivered already, which means there's been about 4,000 babies being delivered as well. So the feedback I have received indicated that the baby box has been significantly helping parents, allowing the parents to focus their finances on other necessary products. So, Presiding Officer, while the UK Government continues their bourach Brexit bungling, or in John Mason's words, bumbling, I support the Scottish Government, which is getting on with the day job by delivering and indeed standing up for the people of Scotland. And I know my time is, I'm done actually, so you've got a wee bit of time in hand. So thank you very much.
Very kind of you, Miss Harper. I don't know whether I'll take you with me, but thank you very much. I call James Kelly to be followed by Colin Beattie. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Families throughout Scotland looking at the programme for government announcement yesterday and looking for measures that would provide a much-needed boost to household income would have been sadly disappointed. As Jackie Bailey pointed out, the economic outlook is a bleak one. The Fiscal Commission records that forecasts will not exceed 1% up until 2023. You know, and it's not just the actual figures, it's what that actually means on the ground. The reality is that there are far too many people in the economy in Scotland working in low-paid jobs. We still have 467,000 people earning less than the living wage. That means if you're working in a fast food restaurant in Rutherglen on the minimum wage of £7.38, you're only earning £258 a week. And what that means to some, as someone recounted to me earlier in the week, is that people are doing 3 jobs in order to you know, make up the gap in their household income. And as we move forward, you know, as fuel and food bills increase at a greater rate than inflation, but wages struggle to keep pace with inflation, then as the Fiscal Commission points out, that household income will continue to be under pressure, and that will have a potentially detrimental effect on economic growth. Added to that, we have had a sustained programme of SNP cuts to public services, and they have also drained economic growth. If you take education as an example, since 2010, £400 million has been cut from education, and that means there are less teachers, 3,500 less since 2007, and less classroom assistants. And ultimately, that does impact on results. The recent batch of results showed that for the 3rd year in a row, hires, which are a key qualification to enter university, the pass rates had declined. Not only that, but in some of the key subjects, not enough people are taking the subjects up. There have been serious declines, for example, in languages, in French and German. I assume that you know, when Brexit happens, we still want people who are qualified in foreign languages in order to be able to interact with companies abroad. And the fact that we don't have enough students taking these subjects up and also have declines in the pass rate is something that's a real concern. At the other end, in terms of entrance into university, there are restrictions in places for home-based students, and that's resulted in a reduction in key areas. In medicine, for example, the uptake from Scottish students in the year 2000 was 63% of all places, and last year it was down to just over 50%. And that comes at a time when the chair of the BMA tells us this morning that the crisis in the NHS is at a tipping point, and we're not training the same number. Yes, sure.
Cabinet Secretary.
I know the opposition are perfectly entitled to give a critique of government performance and policy, and we could argue about it all day. But let's cheer the chamber up. Mr Kelly, what's the big idea, the big single policy idea coming from the Labour Party right now?
James Kelly.
The big idea is to stop the cuts. If you stop draining the £400 million from Scotland's education sector. Because if you continue to cut, Mr Mackay, as you've done repeatedly since 2011, and all the meek backbenchers have pressed their buttons voting for those budgets, you take the resources out. As I've explained, the results deteriorate, and we don't have enough qualified doctors coming out, and you end up with the BMA on the radio this morning telling us that the NHS is at tipping point. So that's a direct result of your policies. Added to that, Mr Mackay, we've had real inaction from the SNP. You tinkered round the edges on tax powers, which you demanded for years, and weren't able to use them effectively, doing nothing in terms of targeting top-rate taxpayers. And also, when the outturn figures were reported, we found out you'd underspent the budget by £454 million, nearly £500 million, stuck down Derek Mackay's sofa in St Andrew's House, rather than providing help to Scotland's public services. In addition to that, not prepared to pass on some much-needed assistance to councils in terms of giving them support for issues like the tourist tax, which would have raised a lot during the Edinburgh Festival. So, in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted I've cheered the chamber up a bit. We've got a bit of atmosphere going. I'm delighted to be cheered from those SNP benches, but on a serious note, what we need is a programme that stops the cuts. We need a proper economic and industrial strategy which has skills at its priority, and we need to prioritise proper and well-paid jobs. That's the difference we need to make in order to move Scotland's economy forward.
Thank you very much, Mr Kelly. And I don't want to halt you in the middle, but please, I can remind members not to use the term you when referring to other members. I understand you were passionate there. I call Mr Beattie, followed by Rachel Hamilton. Colin Beattie, please.
Presiding Officer, firstly, let me congratulate the First Minister and our Government for bringing forward the programme for government. A recent analysis of Scotland's economy make for very encouraging reading. Last month's quarterly national accounts showed an updated gross domestic product growth estimate of 0.4% for the first quarter in 2018, revised from June's estimate of 0.2%. And that compares very well against the equivalent growth rate figure for the whole of the UK, which stands at 0.2%. Output in both the services and production sectors grew in the first quarter by 0.4% and 1% respectively. The construction sector contracted by 1.4%, but we should remember that the weather, specifically the beast from the east, played a major role in this. When compared to the same quarter last year, the indications are that Scotland's GDP has grown by 1.3% in real terms, revised from a first estimate of 0.8%, and very comparable to the equivalent UK growth of 1.2%. And that evidence clearly displays that despite the global financial uncertainties affecting all economies, and after a decade of Westminster's austerity measures that were supposed to cure the UK's financial ills but really have merely promoted poverty and hardships, the measures the Scottish Government are taking to protect and promote the Scottish economy are fundamentally the right ones. There should be no doubt that Scotland is a rich and successful country with many assets that other countries covet. We stand in the top 25 global economies in terms of income per head and rank behind only London and the southeast of England in terms of most long-term indicators. Our exports of goods have increased 12% over the past year, the fastest growth of any nation in the UK, while the latest EY Attractiveness Survey showed that Scotland remains the top UK region for foreign direct investment projects outside of London. However, despite this positive background, there are many challenges we face in the years to come. Unsurprisingly, foremost of this is Brexit. Our export success is directly threatened by the prospect of being removed from access to the single market and customs union, which I'm sure I don't need to remind my fellow MSPs, is a market around 8 times bigger than the UK market alone. As it stands, and including the European Economic Area, Scotland's exports to Europe accounted for over 52% of our exported goods in 2016. And a major part of these exports is oil and gas, by some margin our largest export, and that stands at around 17% of total exports to the EU. And this sector, while it's seen its troubles in the past years, it's beginning to consolidate, and recent analysis by the Oil and Gas Authority shows that production this year is expected to be 18% higher. Meanwhile, the latest Fraser of Allender Oil and Gas survey shows that net confidence of oil and gas contractors is at its highest level since spring 2013. Leaving the European Union without any kind of plan in place is almost certain to jeopardise the cautious growth and optimism that the oil and gas sector is reflecting. Given that oil represents less than 5% of total UK exports, it's unsurprising that the Conservatives have chosen not to emphasise this sector in the Brexit negotiations, despite its crucial importance to Scotland. If we were free to negotiate our own deals, we would have the opportunity to focus on what truly matters to our economy and not have to rely on others who do not care to hear Scotland's voice. But perhaps that behaviour is to be expected from the Tories. Figures released in May under Freedom of Information showed that in my own constituency alone, cuts to disability payments saw East Lothian losing out £1 million and Midlothian losing £1.1 million. The sum lost across Scotland's communities came to a staggering £56 million. For many local people and economies, this money is a lifeline, and to have taken it away not only displays a callous attitude towards the people of this country, but also a short-sightedness in how to support communities from the ground up. At the same time, Labour cannot get away from accusations of short-term thinking. The morally questionable endeavours known as private finance initiatives have had major financial impacts on my constituencies. Midlothian Council is now spending 11%, over £10 million of its annual school budget servicing PFI debts left by the Labour Party a decade ago. East Lothian Council is spending a similar percentage of its school budget, equating to around £8.9 million in PFI debts, and in 2016-17 across Scotland, total PFI repayments cost Scotland over £1 billion. Now, that contrasts with the Scottish Government's investing in our local communities. For example, since 2009, the Schools for the Future programme has invested £9.5 million in East Lothian schools and £50.8 million in schools in Midlothian. Another initiative announced as part of the Programme for Scotland is the launch of the National Investment Bank. The Programme for Government outlined how it will set aside resources of £340 million to fund the bank in the first instance. And I'll put a plug in here, as convener of the cross-party group on industrial communities, I'm pleased to say that this evening's meeting will feature a guest speaker from the Scottish Government who will speak on this topic. The Programme for Scotland outlined a wide range of other measures to promote and enhance our economy. For example, the Government will provide £96 million of extra support to deliver the most attractive business package rates in the UK, with the increase to the rates poundage capped at CPI rather than RPI inflation. The issue of housing is one that many local economies depend on, and the Government will establish a £150 million Building Scotland Fund to unlock new house building, develop new low-carbon commercial property and support research and development. And transport is another sector that strongly ties into the economy, and the Government will invest £60 million in the Low Carbon Innovation Fund to deliver innovative low-carbon energy infrastructure solutions, including electric vehicles, while also investing £1.2 billion in the transport infrastructure. Presiding Officer, I hope it's clear that from all we've heard from the First Minister and the Scottish Government over the last day or so, that Scotland's in safe hands. The Tories willingly choose to ignore investment or support local communities, while Labour simply cannot be trusted to get the sums right without landing a future government with unsustainable levels of debt. I look forward to the implementation of this programme for Scotland.
Thank you. I call Rachel Hamilton, followed by Gordon MacDonald. Ms Hamilton, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the cultural and tourism elements of the programme for government today. And on a cordial note, I'm pleased to see that the Scottish Government recognise the importance of tourism and culture as a force for good. There are several aspects of the programme for government which are positive news for the tourism sector. And I was pleased to have received reassurance from Fiona Hislop that the so-called tourism tax has been ditched. And on the 22nd of June, I received a letter confirming that Scottish ministers are not willing to consider requests to explore a possible tourism levy unless the tourism and hospitality industry are involved from the outset and their long-term interests are fully recognised. But that seems to be at odds with what Kate Forbes said earlier. I also welcome the fact that there's incentivisation to promote agri-tourism, which will help working with farms, estates and offices to develop food tourism. Presiding Officer, we all know that every £1 spent on culture and tourism generates between an extra £4 and £6 for the economy. And the tourism industry accounts for 1 job in 12. It's described as the cornerstone of the Scottish economy. It's vital to the economic performance across Scotland's towns, cities and regions. And the Tourism Scotland 2020 strategy centres on influencing investment in the sector and supporting infrastructure and on improving the quality of visitor experience across Scotland. And that's what I really want to concentrate on today. So it's really a no-brainer that investment in culture and heritage sectors boost the economy, tourism and employment, often in areas where these 3 factors would struggle to perform well. The potential in Scotland for tourism, as we know, is colossal. The exciting and diverse range of attractions which our country has to offer makes it a unique destination, not only for domestic travellers, but also to international visitors. However, I feel that this SNP government simply hasn't grasped the nettle when it comes to maximising Scotland's potential, helping out communities with necessary additional infrastructure. And how far will the £6 million that was set aside last year for the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund really go to alleviate the worries of local communities? Take, for example, the world-famous NC 500 route, a breathtaking drive through some of Scotland's most awe-inspiring and dramatic natural landscapes. The fact remains that the roads along the north coast are narrow, they're bumpy, they're dangerous. Motorbikes and fast cars treat the roads like scale electric tracks. Why wasn't it mentioned in the programme for government? Where is the Scottish Government support for local communities who are crying out for this type of investment? I will take an intervention.
Cabinet Secretary.
It sounds as if the members building to a crescendo of demanding more funds for investment in this particular sector. I understand those appeals, but how does that then match with the only thing that the Conservatives have raised in the Scottish Parliament, which is tax cuts for the richest and tax relief for independent schools?
Rachel Hamilton.
Well, thank Derek Mackay for that intervention. I don't know if you remembered that we had a debate which was called the Scottish Conservatives were suggesting £100 million pothole fund. And also, you did find 10 million. You did, well, it was in our manifesto that in 2016, which was costed. So you also, Derek Mackay, promised 10 million, gave 10 million to local authorities to assist with the road maintenance following the beast from the east. So I'm sure you can find something down the back of your sofa again. Another example...
Ms Hamilton, you might find something down the back of his sofa, but please stop using the term you.
Okay.
I've already
I
reprimanded
apologise, Presiding
everyone.
Officer. Another example is the Glenfinnan Viaduct, and this beautiful viaduct, used time and time again in film and TV, cannot cope with extra visitors due to the lack of car parking capacity. Tourists turning away from visiting as a result of a lack of infrastructure. Historic Environment Scotland own many of Scotland's most famous landmarks and are launching a Robert the Bruce Trail to capitalise on the release of Outlaw King. It's all very well applauding the success of tourism, but the Scottish Government need to commit supporting the sector too. Rural and remote areas are struggling to cope with this demand, which in turn is discouraging tourists from visiting these busy areas. And we don't want that. No one in this chamber wants that. So I'm calling on the Scottish Government to be ambitious, to have an honest and frank conversation with communities in tourist areas or communities that benefit from tourism areas, to ensure that they all have the necessary tools to ensure that we can take advantage of that tourism potential. And that's what I just want to reiterate. This programme for government fundamentally misses the lack of sufficient infrastructure that is required and shows a lack of consideration for rural areas. Moving on to the culture aspect, the programme for government wants a vision for culture that is inclusive. And whilst I'm pleased that the Scottish Government continue to allow free access to Scotland's museums and galleries, I cannot help notice that there's no mention of inclusion for those with, for example, mental health or dementia, for example. We need to work constructively to ensure that cultural experiences and events are accessible and appropriate for everyone. And this programme rehashes old announcements and commitments which offer little for new attractions. It's the same but in a different order as last year. It's the same regurgitated, boring old stuff. But whilst perhaps vital other projects are missing out on new funding, such as concerts, venues, galleries, theatres that could promote inclusive tourism, like the way that Capital Theatres, for example, have done. Presiding Officer, I, like many other colleagues, are looking forward to the opening of the V&A Museum, and it will bring many people to Dundee. It's a fantastic example of where the UK and Scottish governments can pool resources and work together. I also just want to, I know I'm conscious of my time, I just want to make the point that the Scottish Government are responding to what's going on now, which is the Royal Conservatoire review, especially in the year of young people. But it's important that we take a serious look at the provision of music education so it remains accessible to all. And in conclusion, Presiding Officer, whilst there are some announcements in this programme which encourage cultural participation and boost tourism, the bottom line is this SNP government is tired and running out of steam. And frankly, I was really disappointed.
Thank you very much. I call Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Dean Lockhart. Mr MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the programme for government and today's focus on the economy, in particular the commitment to increase annual infrastructure investment by £7 billion for hospitals, schools, housing and a range of other investment projects, which is particularly important for Edinburgh. Edinburgh is one of the economic hotspots of the UK, with many of the largest companies in Scotland having a presence in the city. Just two sectors highlight the success of Edinburgh's booming economy. The financial services sector has grown by 46% over the last 5 years, and the demand for staff in Edinburgh and Glasgow has resulted in Scotland being the best area of the UK for graduate pay. New company start-ups in Scotland are growing at a faster rate than the rest of the UK and is double what it was in 2000. In Edinburgh, the new business start-up 5-year survival rate is higher in Edinburgh than any other UK city, including London, Manchester and Liverpool. Tourism is booming in Edinburgh, with record number of visitors coming to the city last year, and this year is heading again for record levels. The result is that hotel occupancy rates are higher than most other major European cities. In order to support the growing economy in Edinburgh, we need people. And over the last 10 years, the city has had the highest growth in the number of households among Scottish cities. The 12% increase in population over that period equates to 100 new residents on average a week, every week. The council is pulling out all the stops to address the housing need, and this month we'll see the letting of new affordable homes at Fernie Flat, Newk and the Calders area of my constituency, and North Sighthill later this year. There is no doubt we still need more affordable homes, and therefore this increased infrastructure expenditure will support the council to deliver its ambitious programme to build at least 10,000 social and affordable homes over the next 5 years, with a plan to build 20,000 by 2027. Alongside the new homes being built, we need superfast broadband that allows households to watch television, shop online or pay their bills. Unfortunately, in the semi-rural parts of my constituency, this connectivity has been poor. However, the announcement that reaching 100% contract will be awarded in the coming year will mean that this issue of poor connectivity that concerns some of my constituents will be addressed, so that every business and residential property in Scotland will have access to superfast broadband. The families attracted to Edinburgh to take advantage of the work opportunities need good quality educational facilities. Across Scotland, schools that are good or satisfactory have improved from 61% in 2007 to 86% in 2017. Parents in my constituency are looking forward to the next round of funding for the Schools for the Future programme, as a number of high schools in my constituency were built in the 1970s and are now in need of refurbishment. We also have to protect the character of Edinburgh, and the investment in our railway network, currently underway, especially on the Glasgow-Edinburgh via Shorts line, will allow people to commute from further afield where housing costs are substantially cheaper. My constituents who use Curry Hill, Wester Hales, Kingsnow or Slateford railway stations will also benefit from the investment in our railways due to the new Class 385 rolling stock being introduced in the coming months, the most modern trains in the UK. It is not just the investment in railways that is helping the Scottish Government tackle congestion and air quality issues in Edinburgh, but also the investment in other areas of public transport. The Scottish Green Bus Fund has already supported investment by Lothian Buses in purchasing 65 low-carbon vehicles, part of a package that invested £16 million towards 360 low-carbon buses into the Scottish bus fleet. The 8th round of the Scottish Green Bus Fund will see a further investment of £1.7 million that will add over 100 green buses to the fleet, helping to achieve the 50% reduction contained in the climate change plan by 2032. Presiding Officer, my constituency is also home to Dreghorn Barracks and Redford Cavalry and Infantry Barracks. Therefore, I welcome the announcement that the Veterans Commissioner's recommendations will be implemented. These include providing support for those individuals transitioning from the military to find fulfilling civilian careers and to develop an approach that meets the healthcare needs of veterans. I also welcome the support that will help veterans and military spouses who want to run their own businesses find space to develop their business ideas at new workspace hubs that will be located near main defence bases. This year's programme for government is titled Delivering for Today, Investing for Tomorrow. And for my constituents in Edinburgh Pentlands, that is exactly what this government is doing.
Thank you very much. I call Dean Lockhart to be followed by Neil Findlay. Mr Lockhart, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just before recess, the Economy Committee published a wide-ranging report on the performance of the Scottish economy over the past 10 years. The inquiry lasted 6 months, and the committee heard evidence from stakeholders across all sectors. The main conclusions of the report include the following, and I quote, "Economic growth in Scotland in the past decade has been significantly below the performance of the UK economy and Scottish Government targets, as well as historical growth rates for Scotland." I will in a second. The report goes on to conclude that levels of GDP growth in Scotland are marginal, productivity is low and wages are stagnant. These conclusions are supported by what the Scottish Government's own figures tell us about what's happening in the economy. We're seeing the lowest trends in economic growth in Scotland for 60 years. And perhaps now the Cabinet Secretary can explain why that is the case.
Cabinet Secretary.
That isn't the case, and I think that's the point that I was just about to make, that since publication of that report, and looking at, say, specifically GDP, Scotland is outperforming the rest of the United Kingdom. I have read the Economy Committee's report, and I'm sure that Dean Lockhart will welcome this. I will try and implement as much as I possibly can from that very fair report in terms of recommendations. But equally, will Dean Lockhart welcome the fact that Scotland's economy is now outperforming the rest of the UK?
Mr Lockhart.
I would welcome any good news on the Scottish economy because it's such a rare event. And what I would say to the Cabinet Secretary is read page 14 of the Economy report. It shows that for the last 11 years that his party has been in power, the Scottish economy has lagged behind the UK for 9 of those 11 years. That's the economic reality. And every leading forecaster between now and the next Holyrood election is forecasting for the Scottish economy to continue to underperform the rest of the UK. That is the economic reality that the Cabinet Secretary has to realise. Also, wages are falling across the economy, productivity levels continue to decline, record numbers of shops are closing on high streets across Scotland, and we've heard the latest GERS numbers show the highest ever gap in the public finances between Scotland and the rest of the UK, resulting in a record union dividend of over £1,800 per person. Presiding Officer, given this unprecedented economic background, the main recommendation of the Economy Committee, supported by all members, was for the Scottish Government's economic strategy to be reviewed and updated as a matter of urgency. This programme for government was the ideal opportunity for the SNP to do that, to move away from the failed economic agenda of the last 11 years and to set out a new vision for the Scottish economy. But the programme for government fails at every level. First of all, there is no new vision. I need to make a bit of progress. I don't have a lot of time. I might later. There is no new vision. All of the economic measures in the programme of government have practically been announced before. There is nothing new in the South of Scotland Enterprise Board, the Barclay Review, the tinkering with business rates, the establishment of trade desks sitting within British embassies, and the Scottish National Investment Bank has already been debated in this chamber. Now, the programme for government does set out 2 new economic measures, but they lack credibility. First, the National Export Plan, to help increase Scotland's exports across the world, has funding support of less than £7 million a year. To put that into context, there's an announcement today of £30 million for staffing for the Scottish National Investment Bank. This shows how real the ambitions of the SNPs are for growing Scotland's exports. And secondly, perhaps this is what Mr Mackay wants to talk about, the new Economic Action Plan announced as a central part of the programme for government yesterday. But when you look closer, it is hidden in the programme on page 46 as a footnote. All this shows is this, again, is an exercise in spin and no substance from the SNP. But the most fundamental problem with this programme for government is that people no longer trust the SNP to run the economy. The people of Scotland have seen promise after promise being broken by the SNP when it comes to the economy. In the programme for government in 2016, the First Minister announced the Scottish Growth Scheme as a £500 million vote of confidence in business. But more than 2 years later, not a single loan has been granted to Scottish business under that scheme. In the 2016 Holyrood Manifesto, the SNP promised not to increase the basic rate of income tax. We now have more than 1 million people in Scotland paying more as a result of that broken promise. Yesterday, the First Minister promised that the business environment in Scotland will remain competitive, but the SNP continues to punish business by imposing the large business supplement. And the SNP has promised to increase productivity to the first quartile, but again, figures released just 2 weeks ago show that we are still in the third division. The list of SNP broken promises on the economy is endless, but this shouldn't surprise us because, in the final analysis, the SNP will always prioritise independence above everything else, above the economy, above the NHS and above the education. No, I'm running out of time. It was the First Minister, I'll remind the Cabinet Secretary, it was the First Minister herself who made it clear, and I quote, "Independence transcends the issues of national wealth, oil and balance sheets." It could not be clearer what the priority is. Presiding Officer, the people of Scotland want real change. They want an end to constitutional politics and a government focused on the day job. This programme for government is not the answer. It is now clearer than ever. This is a tired government, out of new ideas, out of its depth and running out of time.
Thank you very much, Mr Lockhart. I call Neil Findlay to be followed by Michael Matheson. Mr
Thanks,
Findlay,
Presiding
please.
Officer. The economy doesn't sit separate from public services. Over the summer, I met with and dealt with constituents who want and need real change, constituents who are struggling to get by and who feel powerless in their daily lives, who don't see an economy or society working for them, constituents like those families in Livingston who cannot access the children's ward at their local hospital. They want a fully funded NHS. Or like those in Seafield whose countryside is threatened by a housing development outside the development plan. They want equal rights in the planning system. Or families in Livingston, Adderwell, Bridgend, Dedridge, Dechmont and Stonyburn who are isolated because First Bus withdrew their bus services. They want a bus that takes them to work and keeps them in a job. Or the businesses and workers who have real and genuine concerns about their jobs and futures in post-Brexit Britain. They want reassurances and confidence that they can plan the way forward. Or the people in East Calder and Mid Calder who want a new health centre. Or Mid Lothian who cannot access a GP. Or in Stonyburn who have lost their GP service altogether. Families in Edinburgh who see so-called market failure in social care, leaving their loved ones stuck in hospital instead of being back in their own home. Or the parents and partners taken to the brink, seeing the people they love disappearing before their eyes into a black hole of despair because they cannot get help for their mental health condition. Or indeed, the family and friends of 1,000 people who have died this year from drugs. All of these people need health, social care, and a system of public services that supports them and ends their suffering. The public service failures go hand in hand with economic stagnation. People need real change and they need a government acting indeed for the many, not the few. An economy and a system of social protection that is based on equality and justice. So let me say what Labour would do to address these issues. How we will deliver exactly that. We would introduce a budget to end the cuts and invest in public services with fair and progressive taxation. A planned industrial strategy, delivering an economy based on high wages, skilled jobs and a long-term plan for growth and full employment. A national investment bank, not capitalised by 250 million, but capitalised by 20 billion over 10 years, providing finance to develop new innovation, and a national infrastructure fund, adding another £20 billion for key infrastructure projects. This is bold and ambitious. A fundamental review of procurement, including NPD and PFI, with projects bought out if financially beneficial to do so. A Brexit strategy that puts jobs, living standards, consumer environmental protection and workers' rights at its heart. Investment in our health and social care system to address staff shortages, end boarding out, end bed blocking and ward closures, and the crisis in social care that is here and now. And the common sense ownership of rail services, ending the waste and nonsense of privatisation where money seeps out the system. The re-regulation of bus services, investment in green buses is all very well, but in my region people just want a bus. Deliver a fair deal for our teachers, classroom assistants and council workers. They are at the cutting edge of delivering public services, the services that civilise us as a society and who have a key role in reducing inequality and providing educational opportunities for all. And let me tell you what they don't want. They don't want a plan for Scotland drawn up in the SNP's Cuts Commissions by the Cabinet Secretary himself, and Kate Forbes and Shirley Ann Somerville and corporate lobbyist Andrew Wilson, because it proposes a decade of cuts, the continuation of failed ultra-free market neoliberal dogma, an economy based on so-called flex security. Let me decode flex security for you. An economy where it's easier to sack people. And they have proposed nothing to address the hoarding of wealth by the 1%. Their plan would see, no thank you, their plan would see our public services. Their plan would see our public services being subject to more job losses, more cuts and greater decline. Scottish Labour Party is serious about the challenges we face in a post-Brexit world. Part of the solution is bringing economic power into the hands of people and communities. We need common sense ownership and power decentralised. So it should be up to the City of Edinburgh Council if they want to introduce a tourist tax. It shouldn't be up to the Cabinet Secretary for Culture nor the First Minister. The railways should be publicly owned so that we can keep fares affordable and invest in the services without leaking money to shareholders. This is common sense, and we should see powers devolved down to allow local models of ownership to flourish. Presiding Officer, the choice in Scotland is now clear. We can continue with cuts and austerity championed by the Tories and meekly followed by the SNP, or we can choose a different path, one championed by Scottish Labour, a programme based on hope and ambition that will deliver a progressive agenda to revitalise communities and end the attacks on the living standards of working people. It's time for real change, not another year of tinkering around the edges.
Thank you. I call Michael Matheson. Mr Matheson, please.
Presiding Officer, this is a programme for government that is basically a contrast of two governments. A government is committed to taking Scotland forward, modernising its infrastructure, investing in its economy and making it a modern, vibrant nation, to a government at Westminster that is in utter chaos and goes from one day's crisis to the next day's crisis. I want to touch on a number of points that have been raised during the course of this debate. A number of members have made reference to the number of bills that are contained within this particular legislative programme. I want to deal with this misleading narrative that some members want to create around how you measure a programme for government is based upon the number of bills that's been progressed through Parliament. In particular, the point that was made by Jackie Baillie on the number of bills that have gone through Parliament over the course of the year. Jackie Baillie's been in this place for as long as I've been here, since 1999, as a former minister. She knows very well there are a variety of reasons as to why the pace of bills go through Parliament at a particular point due to committee and parliamentary processes. But equally, she also knows that the measure of a government's activity is not just about legislation, it's about its wider policy agenda as well. And this programme for government is committed to a range of ambitious policy initiatives that we'll take forward over the course of the next year. I'll give way to Jackie Baillie.
Jackie Baillie.
I am grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. I think he has indeed been here as long as me, and I don't think in any of those 19 years the government have produced as few as two bills. But he would also acknowledge, I think, that I recognise that it was also about policy and resources. You're failing on those counts too.
Jackie really wrong on that matter, because if she goes back to the beginning of the Scottish Parliament, there was a real lack of legislation at that point from her own government, the government that she was a member of at that particular point. But anyway, it's a narrative which the member knows is clearly not accurate. But I want to turn to some of the points which were raised regarding bills in this Parliament. Stuart Stevenson, in the course of his contribution, raised issues of concern around matters relating to non-domestic rates and how they apply to former fish factories in his constituency. And as the member is aware, there is a bill coming before Parliament which will give an opportunity for these matters to be debated and to be considered. Alongside that, the South of Scotland Enterprise Agency bill, which will be introduced in order to make sure we're strengthening the economy in the south of Scotland. And when I was in Stranraer a couple of weeks ago, at the invitation of Emma Harper, there's a clear desire there to make sure that we do everything we can to strengthen the economy in the south of Scotland. And this government is bringing forward legislation to help facilitate that. The biometrics bill that was referred to by Stuart Stevenson, I can't say that I know much about the Indian government's ID card system that the member made reference to, but the biometrics bill is about modernising our legislative structure for dealing with the ever-emerging new way in which biometrics data is progressing and in making sure that we future-proof our approach to how that is managed in the future. I want to finally turn to the issue of our justice system here in Scotland. We should always be minded to look about how we can improve and develop our justice system in Scotland, look for new ideas and approaches that can enhance how we deal with our justice system and the matters within our Scottish justice system. But I'll tell you one thing, Presiding Officer. From a party that's cut 20,000 police officers, crime up right across the board, prisons in a meltdown, and a government that has no idea on its justice policy at Westminster, the Conservative Party is not the party we will listen to when it comes to justice matters in Scotland. But, Presiding Officer, a key part of the programme for government is to make sure that we invest in our economy and that we make sure that we create inclusive growth as part of our economic drive. And a key part of the programme for government is our investment in national infrastructure, because there's absolutely no doubt that national infrastructure plays a key part to delivering that inclusive growth. But we only have to look at the history, particularly of UK governments, where infrastructure investment has lagged behind that of OECD countries and G7 countries. So we're leaving the UK to lag behind. We are setting out a national infrastructure mission, one which will see an increase of some £7 billion being invested within our infrastructure here in Scotland by 2025-2026. And I listened to Rachel Hamilton in her contribution, complaining that the programme for government says nothing about investing in our national infrastructure. At the very heart of our programme for government is this record increase in investment in our national infrastructure. And that would real change to communities right across Scotland, local, regional and national, from the health service to our education system, to our transport system and to our other public services. It will make a real change, and it just serves to demonstrate the ambition that we have to grow the economy here in Scotland. I'll give way to Rachel Hamilton.
Rachel Hamilton.
In the programme for government, it specifically didn't list. It's very a woolly statement. I'm hoping that you will commit to some of the tourism problems that are happening within the communities with regards to the NC 500, for example, the car parking at Glenfinnan. These are the things that you need to be, the government need to be looking at.
Cabinet Secretary.
I know the member has an interest in these matters. Can I say that I think the member will recognise that it's important that we look at all aspects of our economy, including the tourism economy, to make sure we're getting the right investment to deliver the maximum economic benefit that can come from that. And by increasing our infrastructure spend, it gives us the opportunity to take that forward. And as the First Minister said yesterday, I will set out in the months ahead how we will take that programme of work forward right across government. But let's just recognise the very significant level of infrastructure investment that's already taken place here in Scotland and is still ongoing. We've just passed the first anniversary of the fantastic Queensferry crossing creating greater connectivity between Fife and the Lothians and greater reliability in that crossing from what we had before. The delivery of the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route is expected to generate £6 billion of additional income into the north east of Scotland's economy, creating some 14,000 jobs in its first 30 years of operation. That's investing in infrastructure that will drive the economy forward in the north east of Scotland. £3 billion of investment in the dualling of the A9 between Perth and Inverness. Again, the biggest infrastructure project in Scotland's history, delivering economic benefits right across the Highlands as a result of that major investment. And since 2007, £8 billion of investment in our rail infrastructure and services, increasing steering capacity and the number of services running, including the delivery of the Borders Railway, which has been a real success to the Borders economy and the people who live there. And I want to touch upon the other major change that we have made to support some of our more vulnerable communities through the introduction of RET on our ferries, creating a real boost to our local economies right across the Highlands and in our rural communities. Presiding Officer, alongside that, with our investment in digital, the record investment has grown so far into digital, and the £600 million of investment in the R100 programme will make a real difference in connecting communities right across this country through super-fast broadband. Presiding Officer, this is a programme for government that's delivering for us today, and it will invest in Scotland for tomorrow.
Thank you very much. And we move on now to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 13747 in the name of Graham Day, setting out a business programme. And members may recall that following the recommendation of the Commission on Parliamentary Reform, yesterday the Parliament agreed to vary the rule on business.